Okay, we're off. Yeehaw. Hi guys, yeehaw, we're off.
Special K. Those humble little flakes. Or however you like. Now that's actually pretty special. You've got to see this.
Thank you guys, good to see ya.
Hello, everybody. You're listening to The Fourth Watch with Justin Paul on the Fourth Watch Radio Network. I hope everyone's having a blessed week. Tonight's going to be another paranormal history lesson with one of our favorite guest historians. We'll be delving deep into the ancient accounts of the demonic race of the reptilian entities, crossing over multiple timelines and cultural records. Many claim that the reptilian entities are merely a mythological conspiracy theory, but tonight we prove the contrary. We've got a lot to cover, so let's go ahead and start the adventure. Submitted for the approval of the Fourth Watch Radio Network. I call this episode Reptilian Species Part 1 with special guest Gary Wayne. Well, it's officially Thursday, and that means it's officially time for the Fourth Watch. It is such a blessing to be back with you all, and we've got a great show on tap tonight. If you're a new listener, we're very grateful to have you tuning in, and we want to let you know that there's a brand new show posted every Thursday at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard. Be sure to head on over to fourthwatchradio.com. That's fourthwatchradio.com, fourthwatchradio.com. There you'll find show archives, links to our free mobile apps for Apple and Android devices, links to all of our websites, as well as a donate page that will show multiple ways you can help support the Fourth Watch Ministries. You can also subscribe to us on iTunes if that's your preferred method of listening. A couple quick reminders. Hollow Earth Chronicles is now on sale at fourthwatchfilms.com. That's fourthwatchfilms, all spelled out.com. Pre-orders opened last week, and we are looking to ship out the first week of August. So head on over to fourthwatchfilms.com and guarantee your copy of the film today. This is a powerful and groundbreaking documentary that you won't want to miss. Also, there's been a slight miscommunication regarding the digital HD release of the film. Due to some licensing agreements, we won't be releasing the digital streaming version until October 1st, as of now. And I do apologize for the inconvenience. But the good news is that everyone can get the DVD. We'll be opening up a link by August 1st for all international orders on the website. We finally have international shipping worked out with one of our distributors, which again will be open on August 1st. So you'll see a link on fourthwatchfilms.com for international shipping. Now, tonight we're joined by my good friend Gary Wayne, author of the Genesis 6 Conspiracy. If you're not familiar with his work, I highly encourage checking out his website, which is Genesis6conspiracy.com. We're excited to finally bring a series of 2 shows that specifically deal with the reptilian species and deliver solid information on a topic that often gets flooded with New Age theories. And I am stoked to join the conversation tonight. So with that said, let's go ahead and welcome on my good friend, Gary Wayne. Gary, welcome back to the Fourth Watch. How are you tonight?
Excellent, and so happy to be back with you tonight, Justin. Hoping that we're going to have a very, very interesting discussion for your audience tonight, and very much looking forward to it.
Well, Gary, it's always an interesting discussion for me when I have you on. So I always laugh when I have you on because, like, my mind gets blown every time.
Yeah, we tend to get into some very interesting stuff, don't we?
There's no doubt about that, and I know people enjoy it every time we have you on. You're definitely one of my favorite guests, and for those of you who aren't familiar with Gary Wayne, you've got to check out his book, Genesis 6 Conspiracy. I know I've already plugged it in the introduction, but Genesis 6 Conspiracy, it's a book that's going to blow your mind. It's going to connect the dots of the reptilian Nephilim bloodline from the origin of evil all the way up until the end times. Like, Gary takes it all the way from past, present to future and ties it all together. And man, Gary, I can't even tell you, like, the first time that book came in the mail, like when it first hit my hands and I opened it, and I'm looking at 30 years worth of research. Like, I'm like, wow, 30 years Gary spent on this book. To be able to hold a book in your hands that has 30 years of research. And I'm not a big reader. Like, I don't read a lot of books outside of the Bible or pseudographical texts, but this is a book that I highly recommend. And man, we're going to dig into a topic that is one that you've covered in your book. And we've kind of brushed slightly on the surface of this topic together. And that is getting into the species of the reptilian or the reptilian species. And this is an area where much controversy tends to linger. Many people who talk about the reptilians or the lizard people, the snake people, or the aliens, a lot of different terms get thrown around surrounding this group of, we'll just say, creatures. But we want to kind of slice through some of the conspiracy theories because not everybody who talks about reptilians are crazy. And not every person who talks about reptilians are part of this New Age movement. And I think as Christians, we need to be able to join the conversation and rightly divide the topic so that we can set aside the lies from the truth. And so that's what we're going to do tonight. We're going to be getting into the species known as reptilians. And this is kind of a little bit of an umbrella of creatures, but we are going to get into some different areas of it from a Christian biblical research perspective. So with that said, Gary, tell us a little bit about the history of the reptilian. And then, or maybe we should start off by explaining what a reptilian is and then getting into the history of it.
I think most people will understand a reptilian as an animal that's in the animal kingdom today and is a cold-blooded animal as opposed to a warm-blooded animal. And I wonder whether or not that has intended consequences, because we look at cold-blooded as sort of evil and against good. And so that's kind of one of those allegories that I thought I would throw out right at the beginning, so for people to think about. And within the understanding of these beings, we have several different levels of beings, and so many of them are referenced in the Bible, even though people may not understand the reptilians in that sort of manner. So the first one that's the easiest sort of to talk about is the serpent that is in Eden. And whether or not this is Satan or it's an Akash, as it's described in Hebrew, and part of the animal world and all, what we do know about the serpent is before the fall and the consequences of the serpent participating with Satan, at least, or being coached by Satan, I think is at the very least to deceive Eve and also Adam. This was known in the Bible as the most craftiest of animals, and an animal that could speak. So an intelligent animal that could speak. And sometime after Eden, immediately after, for punishment, it loses its intelligence, it loses its voice, and it loses its limbs. And so whether or not different varieties of this serpent had wings like it could fly like some of the dinosaurs are depicted, which would be a flying dragon or a flying serpent, it certainly is thought to have walked upright as well, whether or not it's an Egyptian mythology with Draco or with Gnostic Gospels, where they describe it as being as tall as a camel, walking on upright, could do the work of animals, and was sort of above most of the animal kingdom. So that's kind of the first serpent that we're dealing with in the Bible. And then the other one would be the seraphim angels that are depicted, and in his seraphic form would be Lucifer or Satan. And certainly in Revelation 12, we understand Satan as the devil and the serpent and the dragon. So again, linking dragon and serpent together because in antiquity, they're the same thing. And then when we look back at Isaiah 6, it talks about seraphim. And the seraphim and the I am, it means ones, and the seraphs were fiery serpents. And these angels in Isaiah 6 surrounded the throne, and they had 6 wings. So they're at the top of the angelic order. And we know that they look like serpents because when we go to Numbers 21 and we look at the incident in the Exodus, and we have these venomous snakes that are attacking Israel, the word used there is the cash for those serpents, except for one. And that's where Moses puts the image of a serpent on a staff, and that's seraph or seraphim. And that protects and heals Israel. And then in Deuteronomy 8, we also have fiery serpents, as they're called, and that's 8:15, whereas the serpent goes back to the tash in Hebrew, and fiery goes back to seraph or seraphim, because the definition for seraphim are fiery serpent and fiery angelic serpent-like beings, as you take that back to Hebrew. And this is the order that is known as the Watchers, the seraphims. And they're the ones who go to Mount Hermon to mate with human females to produce the Nephilim, who are thought to look just like them. So from a biblical standpoint, that's a sort of quick thing on the reptilians in the beginning.
Now let's kind of dig into the area of Satan or Lucifer. And I know there's people out there who don't believe that Satan and Lucifer are the same. And I realize that Satan can actually be a title for any, and I'm not trying to be loose with my theology here, but in reality, Satan is a title. Ha-Satan is the adversary. And so technically, Satan could be a reference to, in modern language, Satan could be a reference either to the individual, or it could be a reference to the entire team of adversaries who are against God, the enemies of God. But I just want to tag this little piece real quick, Gary. Before the fall of Satan, he was known as the cherub.
Yes.
Now, I don't have a lot of information on the cherubs. There's some information out there. I've done more research on the seraphs. And getting into the seraph angels, you're dealing with, just like you already said, you're dealing with serpentine qualities. And even they're known sometimes as even the burning serpent or the fiery serpents. And these things show up. And we're talking like in all these different religions, we have these fiery serpents showing up and as gods of other religions. And so that right there tells us that there's a connection with the reptilian worship in these different religions. And it does go back to the fallen angels. But how do you deal with the situation of Lucifer? Now, we know that he's considered a dragon. Okay, we know he's called the old serpent, the old dragon. But how do we deal with the idea that he's considered a cherub before he fell?
Well, I think he's either a cherub before and a seraphim afterwards, or he's both, right? Because he is one of the most significant beings in the angelic realm before he rebels. And a cherub is, as it's described in Revelation, it also has 6 wings, like the 6-winged seraphim. Also, you can have wings of cherubs that have a different number of wings, but essentially the cherubs are always surrounding and protecting. And so maybe it's these 6-winged ones that are sort of, because they have the most wings, might project sort of that hierarchy with Lucifer or Satan or Hallel or however you want to call him as being part of this. And he's also described in Ezekiel with these breastplate stones, and there's 9 of them. And that's sort of emblematic of the breastplate that the priests of Israel had as they were attending in the Holy of Holies. And I wonder whether or not he was at that time before his fall actually maybe one of the high priests before God as an angelic realm. But certainly we do know that he's described as a serpent. So he has that sort of serpentine look to him, and perhaps maybe he can change his appearance that way as well. But I certainly look at him being the same individual, whether or not he holds both titles, because he was a guardian cherub, right? And also part of the guardian seraphs that would be around the throne. And I think angels like maybe Michael are probably seraphim as well.
I think it's interesting that we do know that the angels, from all of our research that we've done, and even grounded in scripture, we know that angels can take on other forms. And I know you've used the term changeling. I've used the term shapeshifter. But regardless, we know because the Bible says you could be entertaining an angel unaware, which means you would think that they're human. So they can take on a human form. And if they can go from an angelic spiritual form to look just like a human, then they can take on any form that's out there. I mean, there's really no limitation. So, but it's also interesting, and I'm not selling this idea. I think it's interesting, and this is one of the great things about biblical discussion is that it's possible that there was some kind of a transfiguration in the curse of Lucifer himself.
Yes.
That, like you said, it is possible. I know that's a theory out there that he was a cherub, the cherub that covers, and now he is not a cherub anymore as part of his punishment. I don't know how that would work, but God is sovereign. And if there's nothing in scripture to completely debunk that, then we have to say it's possible.
Yeah, and also look at it from this way is that we know that Lucifer, or whatever Satan, whatever you want to call him, was in Eden, right? And we also know that the serpent is in Eden, and it's obviously a being that's following Satan. So again, from Ezekiel, he's known as a cherub. So is he both, or did he become changed or demoted or whatever to be a seraphim? But it's not a big demotion because seraphims are at the top of the angelic order anyways. But the thing for me that connects them as being the same is you have Isaiah 14:12, where it talks about how Lucifer has fallen, as it translates in the King James Bible, as the name Lucifer. And then in Luke 10, Jesus is talking and he says, I beheld Satan as lightning fell from heaven. And so I think he connects them as the same being. So when I look at all of the aspects, I think they're the same, but I also think after his rebellion, something changes, right? And I think you're probably bang on that he maybe loses that cherub as part of his title.
I mean, technically, the fallen angels, they fell from grace. I mean, there's no other way of titling that scenario. They fell from grace. They were in God's grace. They had everything that they needed to live and worship God and to operate. They fell, they rebelled, and they fell from grace, and they cannot be restored. A lot of people think that the angels, there's going to be a time where the fallen angels get this chance of redemption, but that's not biblical.
Yeah. And what's also interesting about Luke 10:18, and this is maybe just going down a little bit of a path, but after it says, Jesus says that he saw Satan fell like lightning from heaven, he goes on to say, and he says, I give unto you power to tread on serpents and scorpions. And I don't think that's a coincidence, and very applicable to the subject. And of course, scorpions, as you take that back in the Hebrew, that goes back to a crab. A-Q-R-A-B, however you pronounce it, a crab maybe. And these are also scorpions that are coming out of the abyss where the fallen angels and the worst of the demons are put in. And there's an interesting demon god that's in Sumerian that is called the crab Melu and the Gurta Bilu. And these were large scorpion gods with these horrible evil tails that could sting people, and they were also protectors. So I'm going down another line. We're not talking about scorpions today, we're talking about serpents. But in Revelation 9, after they come out of the abyss, right, they had tails and stings like scorpions, and in their tails they had the power to torment people for 5 months.
In the Hollowworth Chronicles film, episode 1, Tom Horn breaks down the insectoids, is what he calls them, demonic insectoids that come out during that time. And so it's interesting because we see language used in scripture that is, the average man would say, well, that's a snake, that's a scorpion, but it's so much more. There's a demonic side to that in the reality.
Well, in the Enuma Elish, where the crab beings are depicted, they're described as large beings with the head and the torso of a man, and the body of a scorpion, avian legs, so bird-like legs, and wings that help them fly, and very destructive weaponry depicted as some form of bows and arrows, and they had the ability to sting their prey from a venomous tail.
I mean, that doesn't sound like a normal scorpion to me, Gary.
No. And they were guardians for some of the gods, and they were created originally in Sumerian legend by Tiamat or Lotan or Nahor, what we would know as Leviathan, or a serpent-like being. So a direct connection, and it's probably why you have these scorpion beings in the abyss, right?
Right, and I always, when I go back and I study the passage in Genesis about the Nakash, and really, if you don't go and research the Nakash and understand the Nakash, then the average person is going to be thinking, well, it was just a talking snake. It was just a python that was able to talk, kind of like how God manifested and spoke through a donkey, which some people still don't know that story. I had somebody write me and tell me, they said, I've never heard that before. I had to look it up. But we do know that there was a satanic element of what took place in the garden, and it was not just a python, which some say. And I've even heard people say that animals could talk in those days, which we don't have any reference in Scripture to prove that. But the bottom line is, what happened there, that was a serpent. That was the serpent in the garden that beguiled Eve. So that's definitely a good place to go back to and start. I want to make one more comment, Gary, on the cherub. In dealing with, we do have biblical reference that the two things that we see in Scripture that stick out about the cherubs, or the cherubims, as the King James says, we're dealing with their guardians, and they're also worship bringers. These are two elements we see, because after Adam and Eve were kicked out of the garden, what we find out is that the garden was guarded by these two cherubims that were guarding the way of the tree of life. And so I do believe that Eden, and we're getting into this in the film, but I believe Eden now is inside the earth. And I don't believe that entities can get into it because it is guarded by the cherubims with the flaming sword. Yeah. So that's very important, because a lot of Hollow Earth believers that are in the New Age movement, they say, oh yeah, well, Eden is inside the earth, and its inhabitants are supernatural entities that take people into the realm of Eden and teach them the ways of the Hollow Earth. This shows up in many accounts, and we break these things down in the film. But that cannot be according to Scripture, because cherubims with a flaming sword are not going to allow any satanic entities into that region, at least from my understanding of Scripture. But the other thing is that they not only guard, but they bring worship. And we have evidence in the book of Ezekiel about Satan, or Lucifer, before he fell. There's references in there, if you study the passage, that he was bringing music. Almost like some people say he was like a choir director, but there's references that he would have had a beautiful voice, or made beautiful music with pipes. And some people can interpret it one way or the other. But I believe the cherubim brought the worship. That was part of their goal, part of their duties. So, but I don't want to go too deep into that, because that's not the reptilian side of things. But it's very interesting, and it's important to hash out, because as you know, people always say Satan is a reptilian, but we also, and they say, well, seraphs are reptilians. But they say, what about the cherubs? Because he was the cherub that covered before the fall. So I think it's important to kind of hit that on the head before we go further. So I'm glad you drove that out.
Yeah, and clearly, again, I mean, he's described as in Ezekiel 28 as, having great wisdom, which is part of what corrupted him by the reason of his brightness, right? So again, and of course we know Satan is also the angel masquerading as an angel of light. So, and that's why light allegories are all there. And that's why he was cast to the ground, again, in Ezekiel 8. So again, you have Isaiah, Ezekiel, and Jesus connecting him to being one and the same being. So I think, and then we have Revelation 12, where he's described as a serpent. So however he gets to be both, or one and then the other, we know they're talking about the same individual. At least that's my opinion, anyways.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this idea of a reptilian race, getting into the origin of that would be directly linked to the reptilian, or we'll say the serpentine class of fallen angels, which would be the seraphs. Now, that would be we'll just say the origin point of anything that would be called a reptilian creature or entity or being. Putting all animals aside, we're dealing with entities now. And so you have these seraphs, these fiery, burning serpents, and oftentimes they're winged, I mean, when you read about these things in the different cultures of the world, you find that they would fly. And so everything lines up that these serpentine angels were majorly part of the conspiracy to create the hybrid offspring that we know today as the Nephilim.
Yeah, and again, you see, even though there's a few different images, and I think there might be a few orders of the seraphims or similar ones, or maybe they just take a slightly different face, but you've got the Anunnaki that are these feathered serpents, right? And serpents, feathered birds. And just as you have Quetzalcoatl as the plumed serpent or the feathered serpent, and all of the Central American gods are of the same description. And you have the Thunderbird gods that are these feathered gods as well. So I think there's a consistency around the world as we look into this winged being that is a dragon, which is a same thing as a serpent, because they were the same thing in antiquity, as I already mentioned. And now put the feathers on them, and you can unite most of this order around the world.
Now, let me just ask a quick question here on what you just said, because you mentioned the Thunderbird. Now, there are even to this day documented cases of Thunderbird sightings on what as researchers we might call cursed Indian land, or Indian land that is under what we would call principalities. And you find out that there's certain, we'll just say, portals or stargates that are referenced by the natives. And they say that out of those portals, and they are very strategic locations, it's isolated. It's not just at any given place. They have mountains that they say those are where the gods come through. And they say that the Thunderbird will come through. And you find some different stories of the Thunderbirds. And I've covered the Thunderbird as a possible connection with the Mothman phenomena that we read about what was it, Point Pleasant. And I did a whole breakdown of Point Pleasant and the Mothman. Maybe I'll re-air the show one day. But the thing about it, Gary, is there are connections with what we call the Thunderbird in native culture, and then what we find over in India and what they call the Garuda. Now, my question would be this to you. If there are angelic connections to the Thunderbird, then that kind of puts my theory kind of down, because I've kind of assumed that the Thunderbird would have been some type of a hybrid entity. Now, I could be way off on this. I'll be honest. I could be way off, but I want to get your take. What are the possibilities of the Thunderbird being a hybrid or a demigod rather than being an angel?
Certainly a possibility, as it comes out of, I think you mentioned Garuda, out of the Indian religion as being an eagle god. It was considered to be a cousin of the Nagas. So it's considered to be on par with them, and almost sometimes depicted as a nemesis of the Nagas or the serpent gods. But again, none of this is totally clear coming out of the polytheist religion. So over in Japan, you have the Tengu, and you have two orders of Tengu. You have a god Tengu, which is this bird-like creature that's also related back to the Nagas out of India. So again, there's a relationship there, but they also have offspring that have bird-like, feather-like creatures as well. So there are some demigods that are created as well that are flying beings, which are different than the normal offspring of giants that we would normally look like. So to answer your question quickly, I think there's a possibility that they were another order of angels, and they also created demigods as well that we would know perhaps as the Thunderbird gods, because some of these aren't raised as high as Quetzalcoatl are, right?
Right.
Right, and just as you've got different orders of these Tengu gods in Japan. So I think it could be both, or again, it's just that typical violation against creation where they create other demigods in the physical world after their own likeness.
Well, it's probably fair to go ahead and drop this in there. I had always been under the impression from my research that Dagon was the half man, half fish. Like, that's always been where I've landed on my research. And I was up at Skywatch TV. We were having some dinner with Derek Gilbert, Sharon Gilbert, and Joe Horn and his family. We were having a really good meal, and I had ordered fried catfish. And they were like, you got to get the catfish. They said it's the best here. So I got fried catfish, and I make a joke about I'm eating some fried Dagon tail. And we all kind of, we all kind of snickered. And then Derek, being the scholar that he is, he says, well, technically speaking, Dagon was not a fish god. And I'm like, oh, wait, what? What did you say? And then Sharon chimed in, and they explained that that's a misconception. Generally, I believe, if I remember correctly, they said Dagon being a fish god goes back to the false interpretation by a man named Hislop, who wrote the Two Babylons, which many people quote him around the holidays for being anti-holiday. And we find out that his book actually has some nuggets of reality in them, but the majority of his claims cannot be vetted with historical data. And so much of what people say about the holidays, they're pulling from this guy's book. So basically, when you check out his bibliography, you find out that a lot of his claims don't hold water with historic proof.
Right.
But anyway, so the bottom line is Dagon, I'm being told now, is not half man, half fish. And it kind of crushed me because I'm thinking, man, I've done a whole teaching on this with Jonah, and now I'm going to have to publicly repent and explain that I misquoted. And so he's explaining that actually the fishmen, the half fish, half men, go back to the Sumerian Apkallu. And man, fascinating topic. Matter of fact, I'm going to have I'm going to have Derek back on to talk about this. But the Apkallu, some show up as half fish, half man. Some of the Apkallu show up like what you're talking about with feathers. Some of them show up as part bird, part man. And I go on so many tangents. I'm sorry, Gary.
They're depicted as fish gods. A lot of people know them as fish gods. I don't get into that difference in the book that I write, because I'm going down one of those rabbit trails, and it's already a big book. But it's very, very clear that that is not the normal understanding coming out of prehistory of who the Dagon was in the description of them, and the fish gods that they say came, with Oannes that came out of the ocean. It's more like they came from across the ocean, but there's two interpretations on that, and I do agree with it that it's got nothing to do with the fish. It's just how you translate that coming out of ancient Sumerian and other ancient languages, because they can have similar types of meanings, just as Hebrew can have several different types of meanings. So I think that's where the confusion is, but it is a rabbit hole to go down and try and explain.
All right. Well, I have done a great job of deferring us from the main topic tonight. but okay, so getting back on the reptilian idea, but it's good to clear up some of these things, because these are good talking points, and people get very deceived by there's a lot of bad information out there. And as I just explained, I succumbed to some bad information a couple of years ago on Dagon, and I've kind of written on that. And so I publicly, I want to say that I was wrong. I was wrong about Dagon, and I want to clear the air on that. But this idea, so we've got these reptilian angels, and these reptilian angels, these serpentine angels, the seraphs, they came down, were part of a major conspiracy, which we've covered so many times, of creating the giants, these hybrid Nephilim offspring. And so we now have not only serpentine angels, but we now have a serpentine class of human, well, let's just call them humanoids, if you want to go that route. They're not fully human, they're not fully angel, but they carry the characteristics of a serpent and of humans. So that is where the reptilian class enters in to the human race. And I want to pick up there and kind of get into some of the features of the reptilian humans, the hybrids.
Yeah, I agree with that. And, as we get coming down from prehistory, we get two different forms, maybe even three, if you want to include the Thunderbirds as another form of demigod, which some of the cultures do. But you get the warrior class offspring of the seraphim angels and the serpent gods, and you also get the serpentine priesthoods that are also offspring, and they form snake brotherhoods of the religions that are going to house the polytheism of the different sort of pantheons around the world, even though they're going to have essentially the same religion. And so if we need to really sort of focus that this is not a separate sort of event that happens either in Sumeria or...
So they use a supersonic missile. Have they already used one?
In the Kisha Maya or over in India or over in China. It's everywhere. And they're all telling the same story of the creation of serpentine beings, some as a warrior class and some as a priest class.
Now, what's going to be the main dividing factor? What's the biggest difference between the warrior class of reptilians and the priest class of serpentine reptilians?
Well, typically the warrior class are going to be the noble class and the kings, right? So, and if you go back as Nephilim as kings, they're all warrior kings, right? As they're being depicted. But the priest class was always part of that organizational structure. And in some of the interviews that we did very early on, you have an organizational structure of the god that they're going to worship in the pantheon. You have the Nephilim king, and then you have the priests and the religion and the secret societies and the development of the magic and the knowledge alongside it. And it's the same organizational structure around the world. So the Nagas, who are a serpent-like being from the seventh heaven, as they're called in India, and are also the same class that starts up in China as well, and that goes through with ancient Taoism and ancient history of the Pangu gods and the heavenly sovereigns, and they're all dragons, and they're actually referred to in many sources as being the Nagas from China that the Chinese accounts are talking about. And so this is a class of beings from heaven, and in India, as I said, they come from the seventh dimension or the seventh realm, and they were referred to as the wise beings from heaven. And so we understand that as in the book of Enoch, for example, as all of this illicit knowledge that is coming to heaven, or on all mythologies that these serpent-like gods are starting civilization, starting agrarian societies, providing education, teaching writing, teaching language, giving them everything they need to start a civilization. And the Nagas were also known to be shapeshifters, and they could also take human form in the Naga tradition. And this is coming right out of the various religious books of India. So this is not sort of legends that we're picking up. This is coming right out of our holy books. And they began, as I said, monks and priests, as to develop the religion.
Vas, it's an interesting topic, isn't it?
And to control the people through the religion and to develop the knowledge. And this is very, very similar to what Oannes does in Sumeria, known as the Sabeti, Sabeti Shemtiu, and or the Sabeti that's over in Egypt, which will also be known as the companions of Horus, or the followers of Horus, and known by so many other different names. And Osiris, who is like a serpent god, is one of these ones, part of this group as well. I think a later version of Osiris, because he's delivering knowledge after the flood to help start civilizations as part of the seven angels, or not seven angels, the seven priests that escape the flood and start, civilization in China, civilization in India, civilization in Central America. Quetzalcoatl is kind of part of that same sort of group and that sort of religion, although I would say that both of those are gods. So they seem to combine these seven sages, or the seven rishi out of India religion and mythology that starts the civilizations, or we're having seraphim angels again doing the same thing after the flood. You can sort of interpret that two different ways. But all of a sudden you can see how all of the cultures around the world are talking about a similar story. And just as you have in Cambodia, you have and they're called the Sri Kamboji, as I recall, out of Cambodia. They believe that this was a reptilian race who possessed a large empire in the Pacific Ocean, ruled over by one of these very powerful serpent god kings called King Kalia. But they were forced away and had to resettle in India, which started the Nagas. And they also believe that there were seven races of Naga. Now, whether or not that meant humans or that meant gods, it's not clear to me. But it's very interesting that so much of mythology and religions have 7 cultic centers around the world.
No, the idea of the Nagas. This is one of those areas that we kind of hit hard in the film. And when you start to study the Nagas, you find out. I mean, obviously, first things first, they are reptilian, and some people call them snake people. It's rare, but occasionally somebody might refer to a Naga as a lizard person. But unfortunately, people are going to mix up, snake people, lizard people. It kind of gets switched around here and there. But technically speaking, by looking at the rock reliefs, the carvings in the caves, the paintings, the idols of Hindu culture, you see that the Nagas are actually serpent people. They literally have the characteristics of snakes and humans. And I mean, some of these reliefs, Gary, they're mind blowing. I mean, if somebody were to come into contact with one of these things, looking the way they looked in ancient culture, I mean, you better check your underwear. I mean, that's pretty much the gist of it. I'm looking at these things and I'm thinking to myself, I've never seen anything that was so specific. That's probably the best way I could say it. They are so specific.
You know what, Vars, you're very right then. First comes salvation. Once you accept that, all these other doors that are super interesting open up. I thought Christianity would be dead boring, but it's a complete opposite.
In the way that they appear in Hindu culture. And I mean, sometimes you see them with the veil of a cobra behind their head. Sometimes you see them with multiple veils of cobras, like almost like it was a multi-headed serpent, but they have human features with a human. It's like a hybrid human snake face, and then they've got other human parts. So they can actually operate the same way a snake would or a human would. But the thing that gets me on the Nagas, and this is kind of wild, but they come down from the heavens according to their belief, and then they now have made their home inside the earth, or we'll just say in the subterranean realm. And so you've got these under earth kingdoms. Sometimes they show up inside dry earth, sometimes they show up in the ocean. But the thing that always connects, there's always an affinity with water. Like we always see with the Nagas, sometimes the entrances into their kingdoms, it's the opening of a well. Sometimes they would enter in through the water and then down into a subterranean dry space. There's a lot of maps, and we'll just say alleged maps that people have charted out to show where Nagas would operate and how they would operate inside the earth and come back up. But we also find out that with the Nagas, they are known to hate humans. They believe that humans are an inferior race. And so the Nagas are on record as abducting humans. Now, this kind of takes us back to the whole alien abduction thing. They would abduct humans, they would take them down into their abodes, and then they would interbreed with them, they would torture them, and they would kill them and eat them. There was a cannibalistic ritual that would take place with some of the Nagas. So it was not like the humans would want to go find themselves a Naga to hang out with. And so I think it's important to kind of show the connection between the fallen angels that many people call aliens and the Nagas, because they both abduct, they both molest, they both interbreed, and they both hate humans. So
yeah, go ahead.
So when I consider this, I think back to the idea that there are these religions that you're talking about, and there's a popular cult. I'll just call it a cult for the sake of our lack of a better word. But there's a cult following in India even to this day, where you're dealing with these men. They're clearly humans, or they appear to be humans at least, and they're claiming to be the Naga people, but they don't look reptilian. They don't look crazy. No, they do look crazy, but they don't look reptilian. But they'll cover themselves in the ashes of dead people. Like they'll paint their body with the ashes of dead people, dead animals. A lot of times they'll use different types of herbs that they'll smoke, hashish, different types of marijuana. Sometimes they'll make paste out of it. But they have this religion of seeking after the Naga. And they're very strange. Some people may have seen there's actually been stories that have been covered in mainstream media about this particular sect of Hinduism, but they're calling themselves the Naga people. And I'm just thinking to myself, if they actually came into contact with a real Naga, I don't think they'd be seeking after them anymore.
Yeah,
Var's completely right. Centaurs were real, and it was a centaur. They were very warlike, apparently. I'm pretty sure it was a centaur that mentored Achilles. I'm pretty sure Centaur taught Achilles how to fight and do war.
Well, they're certainly, and they're from Naga land, and they're were very much a warrior class as they take their cultural history back as part of that Nephilim sort of warrior class that I talked about earlier. And they also like to wear conical headgear, right? And they like to dress up with feathers. And I think
Hi, Diane. Good to see you. I was wondering where you were.
Talked about it, that they're
I'm docking your pay.
And they like to wear like canine teeth, which I think aren't really canine. I think what they're trying to represent is that cobra teeth look, just as the cobra is associated with the kings of Egypt. And also, and for the record, I mean, you also have the falcon image, which is that bird image, which again, even though they have the og.
Yeah, I've seen that Arctic one. Isn't it like a seal with a unicorn horn? I'm pretty sure that's it. It looks really weird.
Serpent gods, and Osiris was a serpent god, and Horus is more of a falcon god.
Say hello to Trace for us,
These are closely associated. But when we talk about a Naga in India, it is a cobra that they're describing, specifically a cobra, whereas a generic snake wouldn't be called.
Yeah, Bart, I've seen the skulls, the sort of human-looking skulls with horns on them like Pan. So, yeah, 100%.
A Naga would be called a Sarpa. So they are describing a specific type of serpent, and in this case, one that goes back to the gods. And they also describe a female Naga that they called either a Nagi or a Nagina. So again, which is very interesting, but they had shape-shifting abilities, so they could take any gender that they would want in this world. And again, they produced offspring. So whether or not these Naga people actually go back to the real Nagas or not, they are certainly worshiping this tradition of those ancient Naga demigods and gods. And the Nagas also carried the elixir of life and immortality, whatever that means, so that people would want to try and live forever through them or by worshiping them, but somehow they had some sort of elixir of life or immortality. And they also had a specific holy mountain, which again would be similar to what all the gods around the world would have. And they believed there was good Nagas and bad Nagas, just as not all the seraphims would have rebelled, right? And the good Nagas were guards, and they would protect from the Devas, and the Devas would be the fallen ones or the evil ones in Sanskrit and all of the Brahmin and Hinduism and Buddhism religions that would fall, down through that lineage.
There we go, the links. We missed the links, guys.
So, again, just so many interesting connections with what they're talking about and what we hear about these reptilians from around the world.
Now, one last thing I want to hit on about the Nagas in India is you have this whole narrative surrounding the Nagas, and you've got a rich history that anybody can research. Like this information, it's mainstream, it's not hard to find, but you also find generally you're dealing with the ancient cities of Patala and Bhagavati. But then you get over to Tibet and you find a shrine, a monk shrine, if you want to call it a monk shrine, I guess you could. But there's a shrine which is to the Naga as well. And so you're now seeing a connection, miles apart. And then you go further into China and you've got another connection with the Naga people. And you get to China and you find out that they've got these shops, these like herbal, I don't know what you want to call them. I'd probably try to call it more of a new age, new age type, magic, medicine man kind of shop. But they've got teeth that they're selling in China. And I've never seen them in person, but I've heard stories that you can go to China and buy what they're selling as dragon teeth. And they're not normal teeth. Like they're clearly not the teeth of a regular animal or even a large animal. They're sold as dragon teeth.
Wow.
And I tend to lean towards the idea that it's possible that these are the teeth of hybrids, or possibly the teeth of what people would call a Nephilim. But they'll grind up the teeth, and then they'll ingest the powder of the ground tooth. And this is an ancient tooth. This isn't like a tooth that they just pulled out of a person yesterday. These are ancient, and they grind them up and they ingest the powder. And so there might be a connection between that and the elixir of life that you're talking about. Maybe a similar.
Yeah. certainly a belief there that they can provide immortality. They don't seem to have that blood drinking sort of ideology, but they do have this ideology that you can find this sort of fountain of youth. And that's actually how the Japan culture gets started, and the dynasty descends out of the Li dynasty. Is one of the royals and part of the priesthood is trying to find this mountain of immortality to bring back to the reigning kings. That starts the Yamamoto dynasty. So again, they all of these things descend back to the same sort of Naga belief that comes through with the Brahmins and the Aryans out of Mesopotamia. And you also have this filtering down into Thailand, where they call them the Phaya Naga, and they're depicted as dragons. And in Malaysia, as Sri Siman, as a Naga. This is all connected because the Eastern religion splits. One goes into Mesopotamia, and one goes into India, into the Indus Valley of this ancient Zoroastrian religion, as they split away from Babel. And what's interesting about that in Zoroastrianism is their god is referred to as Ormazd, which is the serpent. And they even use the same type of names for the evil gods like Devas. So there is a definite belief system that is all connected. And through that religion of the Ahura Mazda, and they're the same religion, understand that Enki or Samael was called Ormazd, or the serpent of the night, or the Ahura Mazda. And Enki of Sumeria, he is described as and depicted as in ancient glyphs as a serpent, and is the serpent god coming out of Sumeria and from Samael, where Samael comes from. So Sama is the town which he was the lord over, as that sort of history goes back to. But he is definitely the serpent god of Sumerian history, and the one who is the enemy of Enlil. And again, I just can't underline enough that all of these things are related. And just think of Samael as in Hebrew as meaning the venom of God or poison of God. And that's why you have these poisonous teeth that elicit the poison in the snake. All of this is connected.
When you're dealing with the venom, that takes us right back over to the idea of these insectoids coming up in the tribulation and having a venomous sting. I can't help but to see that connection again. And so we're seeing connections now, not just with the serpents, but with these other hybrid entities that are going to show up on the face of the earth.
Yes. And, I think I'm trying to think of the verse in Ezekiel, where it's talking about Ezekiel 7, I think, and it's talking about these beasts that are going to attack the land of Israel, and it's the noisy beast. And if you take noisy back, it goes back to Ra, which is meaning totally evil. And of course, Ra is one of those gods, these Ogdo gods, these serpent gods of the Egyptian pantheon. Just amazing at how all of these sort of things kind of connect. And in ancient Egypt, they had a holy crocodile that they called Draco. And of course, Draco is Latin for dragon. And Draco and Draconto, which are sort of the root out of Egyptian or out of Greek, means to watch, as in watcher. And of course, Draco and Drakon are the Greek meaning for serpent. And also you have this word that sort of flows over into Dracula or Dracul, which means a dragon, and the A means the son of a dragon. And of course, that's what they base the vampire.
Oh, sorry.
Tales on, and this is an allegory of the matriarchal bloodline of the dragon and the serpent. And of course, they have the cobra teeth that they use to bite into the necks of human beings, which is the same teeth that's on the vampire that they're talking about, that you were talking about with the Nagels. or the Nagas in India that they do to this day, and that gives this vampire immortality. So again, these allegories and meanings just keep rolling over and through time.
Now, in the next episode that we do when we continue this, I definitely want to get into the Dracula connection. I want to kind of move it up into the bloodlines and getting into, we'll just say, modern accounts. But for the time that we have left, Gary, let's kind of go through this little situation of the lizard people and the snake people, because they're both considered reptilian, and we see both showing up in different cultures. So, like, I mean, the crocodile, lizard-like features, snake-like features. Where do you believe this thing splits off into these two? Because obviously the origin point has to be the same. The origin takes us back to the angels. So at what point do we branch off and have lizard people and snake people as two separate entities?
Lizard people and which people as two separate entities?
Yeah, because some cultures will refer to the serpent people, and then some refer to lizard people.
Right, and they're the same. I think they're the same, and they're just using different words to describe the same thing, because lizards and serpents are essentially part of the same sort of reptilian class. There may be a different distinction in there, or maybe there's some survivors of that the fallen angels did of the original serpent that was in Eden. That's a little bit different. It is more like a crocodile walking upright, which is why you have the depictions of the holy crocodile in Egypt and Sobatek. So that may be a distinction in the type of beings, because I don't think that was a being that would be considered a demigod. It was just a...
Okay, guys, I heard Trump's indictment was sealed up. So it's a sealed indictment, which means there's no actual date for the arrest. That's how I understood it.
Another form of intelligent being, if we can understand it that way. So there are probably different subclasses in here, but clearly...
Yeah, it's a big distraction, Diane, 100% right.
From the various gods out of the rebellious angels that create these demigods in all sorts of forms. So again, you could have a few different sort of splits as to what type of being is being created, or maybe they did some intermixing of other DNA with that crossbreeding somehow, because they would have had the fallen angels have the ability to do DNA manipulation as well. So there's all sorts of different ways that they could create different classes of these types of beings. So I'm not sure whether or not I answered your question or not, but...
Well, no, I agree with you, because as I mentioned earlier, there, a lot of times the lines get blurred. Some cultures say lizard people, some say serpent people, and we see the characteristics of both in many of the paintings. And like you said, we're dealing with reptile. I mean, that's the root word that we have in America: reptile, reptilian, and there you have your snakes, your lizards. Amphibians are in a whole separate class, obviously.
And dinosaurs would be considered reptilian as well. And we didn't have a name for dinosaur before they made it up a couple hundred years ago, because they used to be known as dragons. So even those ancient dinosaurs, whenever they were around, would be considered, to me, to be a reptilian type of being that would be a favored species of the seraphim angels. And also, I just wanted to point out, I missed this a little bit earlier, out of Kisha Maya, you get a group of serpent priests that are called knuckles. And they're very, very similar to the seven sages. And they're also believed in these writings as they come down through the ancient writings that, and I know many of them were lost, but there's writers like Laplangian and Churchward who wrote about some of the accounts that they got from these priests. And what they said was, though, is that the knuckles were connected to Ra, their sun god. And in the Kisha Maya tradition, Ra was the sun, and also the name used for Nakal. So, and these were, again, a priest class very similar to the Nagas out of India and related to them, but in most people's accounts.
Well, the idea that the Nagas would be able to enter into water. And I mean, look, a crocodile can go underwater for a long time. A snake can go underwater for a long time. Even sea snakes, from what I've seen, sea snakes have to come up to get some air. But there are some sea snakes that have gills, if I'm not mistaken. But that kind of takes us back to the discussion we had, a couple years ago, or maybe a year and a half ago when we first did a show together. We talked about
Thinker, no, that's the ANZ Bank. Apparently, they're putting ATM machines as the tellers, but it's only the ANZ Bank at the moment. There's still ATMs all over the shopping centres. But what's interesting, there's now Bitcoin automatic ATMs. You can get Bitcoin on an ATM in the shopping centre.
how there's a theory that the Nephilim would have been able to have similar attributes to some of these reptiles, to being able to take a deep breath and go underwater for a longer time. Now, some people believe that the Nephilim would have had gills, but and I've kind of leaned on that for a little while, Gary, thinking that it's possible. But if that were the case, then they would have been able to all survive the flood if they had gills. So I don't believe they had gills, but I do think that they would have been able to stay submerged for a longer time than a human would.
We certainly do get some things coming down through history that there is an affiliation with them to water and with the gods, and that many of these portals that come down through, let's say, fairy mythology or the alien mythos has these portals underwater. So again, there's an affiliation there, just as you've got fairy dolmens around the world that are portals that are designed to go into another dimension, and dolmen actually translates as portal. And just as you have through so many other sources, you have caves in the mountains, as you were mentioning earlier, as portals into the other worlds. That's the Bigfoot and the little people also are related to in going through caves. And so they can also go through shaves and fairy mounds. So there's this whole sort of underwater portals and portal thing that in different dimensions that are also completely connected in every seemingly story that's around the world, except that in every story in the world, we don't get the whole story.
Right. But one thing we can't separate from our historical research is the connection to the fallen angels and a class of serpentine reptilians. This is one thing, like you said, it shows up all over the globe. All over literally every continent practically has history of some type of a serpent god, feathered serpent, flying serpent, burning serpent, fiery serpent. The list goes on. It's kind of like the old Forrest Gump, where he's talking about shrimp. Bubble Gump's talking about, shrimp this, shrimp that, shrimp that. I mean, it just keeps going on. There's so much connection between the fallen angels and the serpentine class.
There's a description of these gods in a Gnostic gospel called The Origin of the World, and they're talking specifically about the watchers as serpents, and the description that they gave is that they had long, narrow faces, prominent cheekbones, elongated jawbones, slanted eyes, and thin lips. And I make the case in the book and in many of the shows I do that their offspring look just like them. And then if you want to match all of that up, you can go to a King Tut museum and look at Akhenaten, and you're going to get that type of facial look. And this is like 2,000 years after the Nephilim are first come around the world. So even after all of that diluted bloodlines, you get that same sort of look. And we get coming out of the Quiché Maya, and we get out of Atlantean mythology and other ones that these are the same descriptions that the Titans had. And they either had red hair and hazel or green eyes, or blue hair or blue eyes and blonde hair, as they come out of prehistory with that same type of look. So again, we get consistencies of this whole ideology in all religions around the world. And then, of course, I'm comfortable talking about all of that because I know what it says in the Bible about seraphims. And of course, the Aryans show up with this belief system in the Punjab in the Indus Valley about 2300 BC. And they're bringing with them this religion that we talked about, the differences between Zoroastrianism and the Sanskrit version that turns into Hinduism that forms the Brahmin traditions that go down. They're the ones who take it to India. And the Aryans, the Nazis believe, came from Thule, which is their real or their folkish idea, I'm sorry, not real, folkish ideology of another type of Atlantis, or an Asgard type location, as they would understand it. So they believe that the Aryans escaped out of Tartarus in Scythia, and migrated north and west and east and all over the place. And these were the giants of the Titan rebellion. And so, believe me, they take these beliefs back to prehistory. And so this is not uncommon. That's why you have a depiction of Dracula as the other description, because he typically has hazel or green eyes and red hair, right? Just as Vlad would have had. And again, we get these Peruvian skulls and the North American skeletons and skulls coming with red hair. Just as the Tuatha De Danann were thought to have the red hair and the green eyes as the other sort of version of these giants coming out of Scythia. And you cannot discount that this is all being kept alive for a reason. It's their belief. They believe it's their history, and we're going to see all of this come about in the end time, being thrown in our face that we've been totally misled, A, by science, and B, by Christians in the Bible as to what happened in prehistory.
Hey, Bobby, good to see
Let
you.
everybody know in closing how they can follow your work and keep up with what all you're doing.
Well, the best way to follow my work is probably through Facebook, and you can contact me there, or through my website, Genesis6conspiracy.com. But follow me under Gary Wayne or my two Genesis 6 conspiracy pages, and I'm posting, several times a week with interesting stuff that either connects into the subject or just interesting things about the Bible that you might be interested in. But all of it will be thought-provoking. If you do get a hold of me, I will get back to you if you have a question. And also you can follow me on Twitter at GaryWayne63, at GaryWayne63.
Well, Gary, thank you so much for coming on the Fourth Watch, and we really look forward to having you back on again really soon to continue our discussion on the reptilians. Until the next time we talk, Gary, God bless and have a good night.
Okay, I'll do the second part now, which was what? Oh, angels, giants, and demons. Hang on, let me find it. There it is.
History, and maybe encourage people to have a closer look at the Bible at the same time, which is what I always try and do.
Hello and welcome to the Nomad Podcast. I'm your host, Nomad, and with me today is author and researcher Gary Wayne. Gary's extensive research has encompassed the Bible, Gnostic scriptures, the Quran, Gilgamesh, and other ancient epics, language etymology, secret society publications, and much more. Thanks for joining us today to share your knowledge, Gary. How are you and what have you been up to lately?
Well, thank you for inviting me to guest on your podcast, and so happy to be here and hoping to, discuss a few things with your audience that they may have not thought about or want some more information on. So, so I've been very, very busy. I do probably more shows than my wife would like me to accept in a week, but I try and fit everybody in. And I'm also working on another book as well. And then I just agreed to work with the Nephilim Anthropology Project group out of London, working on bringing a Christian perspective to a lot of the New Agers and seculars and other people that are in there, and sort of look at what we can talk about in terms of a common history, and maybe encourage people to have a closer look at the Bible at the same time, which is what I always try and do. And so between that and the second book that I've got coming out, which will be a prequel, not a prequel, a sequel to the Genesis 6 conspiracy, and more targeted directly at Christians, as opposed to the first book where I'm trying to draw people in and give them a little bit more of a worldly view in terms of how to understand our history and the other belief systems and how they intersect. This one is designed more to Christians because what I've heard from people over the last number of years through contact on shows and social media, is that they want more information what's in the Bible, and they want to go deeper. So this is a deep dive on fallen angels, giants, mostly after the flood, because that's where we get most of the information on how that fits into prophecy. So it's going to be titled the Genesis 6 Conspiracy Part 2, I think. And the subtitle will be Prehistory and Prophecy, and maybe another word in there for, we might throw Rephaim in there, which is a term that people I think need to become more familiar with.
Yeah, I love that. And I would actually love to just start there if you don't mind. Would you mind telling us a little bit about kind of the difference between Rephaim and the Nephilim?
Yeah, I think it's such a important question. And that, and in combination with the flood, are two really, really important pieces if you're going to try and understand prehistory. And if you're trying to look at, okay, here's what the polytheist cultures are talking about, how does that match up? Because it gets kind of confusing in all the different sort of vernacular lenses that are used in polytheism for their religions and their mythologies. But if you understand that there's a flood and that there are giants both before the flood and after the flood, and then start to add that into that when they're talking about gods, as in their parent gods, let's say like a Kronos,
Hi,
welcome
to the
parent
channel.
gods of the and Anu of the Sumerian, and on and on and on. They have offspring gods that people are a little bit more familiar with, like Zeus or Anki and Enlil and Osiris and Isis. Those are the offspring gods that tend to come to power after the flood. It's not that they killed those fallen angels or gods as they're understood in polytheism. It's that because they're immortal, they actually went to the abyss prison. And that's why they're able to rise up like an army, which host of heaven for angels, as it's described in the Bible. There's one for the fallen and one for the loyal angels. And that is defined as an army, which has rank and order. So you would just have one sort of succeed in whatever that hierarchical structure is. So when you understand that, then you look at the term Nephilim and Rephaim. And people have probably heard both, but more the Nephilim. What people don't understand is Nephilim shows up only 3 times in the Bible as a Hebrew word. So it's translated as giant, but it only shows up in Genesis 6:4, the creation of the giants before the flood, as it's translated in the King James Version Bible, and in other English translations it might say Nephilim, might say something else, but typically those are the two terms. And the word giant there goes back to the Hebrew word Nephil, which is the singular form of Nephilim. I am is the male plural, and it's defined as a tribe of giants. It can also mean bully, but specifically understood as giants in the antediluvian concept. The 2 other times it shows up is in Numbers 13:33. And for people who may not be familiar with that very famous chapter, this is the chapter where Moses sends the spies or the scouts. I prefer to call them scouts. I have a Christian biases. And so they send them into the land of the covenant and throughout the land of Canaan. And this is the embellished report where it shows up by the terrified scouts, not the details that Caleb and Joshua do, talk about first, but this is what they have seen terrifies them, because they see 2 kinds of peoples. They see the Anakim, also known as Anakites. I tend to call them Anakim. And they see people like the Amalekites, like the Canaanites, and several other tribes like the Amorites there that are taller than them, but distinct from the Anakites, or the Anakim. And in Deuteronomy 1, that's where we find out not only that they're stronger, but in the recap of the accurate details that were reported by Joshua and Caleb, Moses is retelling the story and distinguishing the ones who are taller, who are like the Amorites and the Amalekites, and the Anakim kings that they see there. So in the embellished part of the report, you get a report where the Anakim are the children of giants. And it says that twice in terms of giants in Numbers 13:33, and both times that word goes back to the Nephilim. But here's the key that people need to understand, and it's a really important detail, is that in Deuteronomy 2, you get a description of several different tribes, not all, of the Rephaim. And if people are looking for that word Rephaim, it's going to show up in Genesis 14 in the War of Giants, from the giant kings coming out of Mesopotamia to fight with the giant kings in the land of the covenant. And then in Genesis 15, where Abraham is being shown all the land from the Euphrates to the Nile River, is going to be showing up with the mighty seven plus three other nations, but they're included in amongst the mighty seven there as the Rephaim. The other three are what I call the KKK of ancient times, and that was the Cadmonim, the Kenim, and the Kenazim. And I would actually qualify those as the mighty 10 at that time, but they only show up as 7 with a few changes, and Rephaim being removed and being replaced by the Horim after that. But the point in Deuteronomy 2 is this, is that the Anakim are described as giants, but that's the word Rephaim. So it's accurately just describing them as giants, but different than the Nephilim, a different word. So they're not Nephilim, they're Rephaim. And so what they're trying to do in the report to scare people is to get them to imagine the antediluvian giants, which are huge. Not that the Rephaim aren't giants, because they're very, very large. Anywhere from, with Goliath 400 years later being 11 feet 3 inches using a royal cubit versus the common cubit. But even if you use that, it's 9'9". So huge. And Og would be somewhere between 12 and 14 feet tall. So what we have going on here is a testifying of the veracity of the Nephilim there as to these incredibly more powerful and larger giants before the flood, with the post-diluvian or after the flood giants. And so they're trying to scare the Israelites even more. They should be rightfully scared. And they haven't yet forged their faith yet to take on the giants and the hybrid giants. But these are not the Nephilim. So Rephaim shows up from the root word Rapha, I am being the male plural, 25 times in the Old Testament after the flood. So many more times than Nephilim. So the difference is that we don't get Rephaim before the flood scripturally. So my distinction is that these are giants that show up after the flood and starts to tell a story more accurate to the biblical understanding, although I'm open to both that, maybe perhaps Rephaim were before the flood and they survived and Nephilim didn't. More likely because they're not as big by what, as what is sort of being implied and inferred in Numbers 13:33. They are a second creation of giants that show up after the flood. Now, we're not told specifically how giants show up after the flood, although you can make a very good case for a second incursion, which I tend to fall on. We don't have that sort of smoking gun verse to say, yes, that's what happened as in Genesis 6:4, even though it says the sons of God go to the daughters of men again. That could mean just before the flood, or it could also be part of preparing the reader for that they're going to do this same thing again after the flood. And if that is done again after the flood, then that starts to make sense of having names sort of show up for giants before and after the flood. Like you have Gilgamesh that shows up after the flood in the Epic of Gilgamesh and being recreated, and he is 2/3 God and 1/3 human, just as Enkidu is, and this is part of the flood story of the Epic of Gilgamesh. So he's not on the ark that Tishtan and all of his family of giants are, because they're 2/3 God and 1/3 human, because later on he goes for wisdom for the guy who survived the flood, right? So this is a different creation, and it's a second incursion there, as well as you get a survival story in polytheism as well. So I look at it as it's more likely that they were created after the flood, and then you get the offspring gods, who would be like, as I mentioned earlier, Osiris and Isis as the Egyptian famous ones, and you have gods like Poseidon, which are famous for creating the giants after the flood, for an Atlantean-based story, and I think there's a conflating of stories there. And so I think what happens with these gods, like the Baalim, that would be more familiar with Christians from Mount Hermon, that they create these Rephaim just as it's recorded as such in the Ugaritic.
Hi, Trace. Good to see
The
you.
word Rephaim comes from the Raphaim, and actually trying to bring Baal back in their fertility rituals to create more giants in the Ugaritic text, that they would have went to the abyss as well for the same crimes as their parent gods did. And so what happens is those gods move up, and they also inherit a lot of the stories and the mythos around it, because they're the new sort of reigning order of gods over.
Gee, that's a big day, AI.
The earth.
Yeah, could I ask a question on that? So it sounds like you're saying that the Rephaim were potentially, we're theorizing a bit here, but created after the flood instead of surviving the flood?
That's my favorite position. I'm open to surviving. I'm open to somehow on the ark some way as well, whether or not, however you want to get about it. There's different variations of survival on the ark, and then other ones that would be survival, in polytheism as other arks that were supplied by the fallen angels. But also you get versions of off the earth, in the earth. So I just sort of put it into three buckets. But I separate the ones on the ark because there's a lot of people out there that tend to fall into that. It's in the genes of the wise. That's where the giants come from. And I don't think that sort of stands up. But I leave it open as a possibility with survival somehow, some way as the other option. But my favorite one is that's because it makes more sense scripturally for me, is a second creation.
So what does that look like to you? Would that be like somewhere down the line from Noah's family, we get people who are doing some genetic manipulation or something like that?
No, I think it's exactly as the same creation that is done before the flood, so that you get Baal and Ashtaroth as mating with humans to create these demigods. And that term demigod is the polytheist term that shows up in secular in the secular language as being a different meaning in ancient times as what's understood as today, because they kind of sort of gloss over it. What it means is the offspring of a god or a goddess and a human female or a human male. And so these were the demigods, the divine representatives of the gods, reigning as kings, ruling the religions and the priest class and the whole upper end of the society, both before and after the flood.
Okay, so are you saying that I'm still trying to understand how these Rephaim or other entities were created after the.
Okay. I think my Wi-Fi dropped out. Hang on. Yep, Wi-Fi's dropped out. Hang on, guys.
However you want to get about it, there's different variations of survival.
Hang on, I'll take it back a bit so we can catch up.
Gods did. And so what happens is those gods move up, and they also inherit a lot of the stories and the mythos around it, because they're the new sort of reigning order of gods over the earth.
Yeah, could I ask a question on that? So it sounds like you're saying that the Rephaim were potentially, we're theorizing a bit here, but created after the flood instead of surviving the flood?
That's my favorite position. I'm open to surviving. I'm open to somehow on the ark some way as well, whether or not, however you want to get about it. There's different variations of survival on the ark, and then other ones that would be survival, in polytheism as other arks that were supplied by the fallen angels. But also you get versions of off the earth, in the earth. So I just sort of put it into 3 buckets. But I separate the ones on the ark because there's a lot of people out there that tend to fall into that. It's in the genes of the wise. That's where the giants come from. And I don't think that sort of stands up. But I leave it open as a possibility with survival somehow, some way as the other option. But my favorite one is that's because it makes more sense scripturally for me, is a second creation.
So what does that look like to you? Would that be like somewhere down the line from Noah's family, we get people who are doing some genetic manipulation or something like that?
No, I think it's exactly as the same creation that is done before the flood, so that you get Baal and Ashtaroth as mating with humans to create these demigods. And that term demigod is the polytheist term that shows up in secular in the secular language as being a different meaning in ancient times as what's understood as today, because they kind of sort of gloss over it. What it means is the offspring of a god or a goddess and a human female or a human male. And so these were the demigods, the divine representatives of the gods, reigning as kings, ruling the religions of the priest class and the whole upper end of the society, both before and after the flood.
Okay, so are you saying that I'm still trying to understand how these Rephaim or other entities were created after the flood? You're saying by like spirits that were mingling with humans?
Not as a spirit as we understand angels being spirits. And that wouldn't have happened before the flood either, because how does spirit create offspring through some sort of sexual copulation with a physical being, right? That just sort of is one of those things that we need to take a deeper dive on as to what's going on here. So what we do know is this, is that, for example, in the Sodom story, and just before the angels go to Sodom, they show up with the pre-Jesus, the Word made, who later will become Jesus. There's 3 of them there, and they're taking a physical form. They're eating, they're drinking, they're touching, and so what we know is angels there, and the ones that continue on to Sodom, and other references we get about angels being able to do that, is that they're going to take a physical body. We need to understand that in the terms of what that means. Is if they're a spirit being, to interact in the earth in a physical way, they want a physical body. So that means you need to create the DNA that would go with it, which would be the ability thereafter to create, and they would look like you, and they would have some of those powers, including that counterfeit spirit. Where we get that biblically to understand that, where that comes together, is the word habitation in Jude 1:6, where it's talking about the angels before the flood, who were sent to the abyss prison, the pit, for their crimes. And that's the crimes against the Holy Spirit and crimes against creation for creating these demigod giants and passing on the counterfeit spirit, the evil spirit that we would understand, or the demon spirit. And those were immortal spirits. And that's why God ends that in Genesis 6:3, which limits life to 120 years, which is part of the creation story of the original Nephilim. So from the original creation, there's a degradation of any ones that would be created after that, and then again after the flood. But it's that word habitation that starts to give us an understanding of how this happens. So habitation is the Greek word oikoterion, and it shows up only one other place in the New Testament, in 2 Corinthians 5:2, for the house in heaven. And it means a dwelling place for the spirit. And so they left their dwelling place for the spirit in heaven. and they can come down to the earth and act as opalescent beings or spirit beings. But if they want to physically interact, they're going to need to have a dwelling place for that spirit. So in the New Testament, we're told about there's a makeup of three parts. And you can also include the mind, but that's kind of an extension of what happens. So you have the body, you have the soul, and you have the spirit. And it's the spirit that comes from heaven that meshes with the soul that only God and Jesus can separate. Okay, so it becomes one, but it needs that body and that soul to be the dwelling place for the spirit. And so by creating that oikotarian, they're able to create a physical body. This happens again from a super Christian perspective, if I can put it that way, with Jesus, where you have the Holy Spirit. It's going to create the oikotarian within Mary, without sex, which is the soul and the body that's going to be developed so the word can become flesh. So that Jesus can interact physically in the world as being part human, not just on that temporary sort of basis, but part human because it's a human soul and body that's been grown up within the womb, and then atone for the sins of the world as the creator of the world at God's command, right? That's the word of God. Mm-hmm. And so if we understand that, then if you have a body,
okay, I don't know if the Wi-Fi's dropped out. Let me just check. It's pretty windy outside, Gabe, you said. Yeah, look, Wi-Fi's dropped out again. Thanks, Fast.
before the flood, who were sent to the abyss prison, the pit, for their crimes. And that's the crimes against the Holy Spirit and the crimes against creation for creating these demigod giants and passing on the counterfeit spirit, the evil spirit that we would understand, or the demon spirit. And those were immortal spirits. And that's why God ends that in Genesis 6:3, which limits life to 120 years, which is part of the creation story of the original Nephilim. So from the original creation, there's a degradation of any ones that would be created after that, and then again after the flood. But it's that word habitation that starts to give us an understanding of how this happens. So habitation is the Greek word oikotarian. And it shows up only one other place in the New Testament in 2 Corinthians 5:2 for the house in heaven. And it means a dwelling place for the spirit. And so they left their dwelling place for the spirit in heaven. And they can come down to the earth and act as opalescent beings or spirit beings. But if they want to physically interact, they're going to need to have a dwelling place for that spirit. So in the New Testament, we're told about there's a makeup of three parts. And you can also include the mind, but that's kind of an extension of what happens. So you have the body, you have the soul, and you have the spirit. And it's the spirit that comes from heaven that meshes with the soul that only God and Jesus can separate. Okay, so it becomes one, but it needs that body and that soul to be the dwelling place for the spirit. And so by creating that oikotarian, they're able to create a physical body. This happens again from a super Christian perspective, if I can put it that way, with Jesus, where you have the Holy Spirit. It's going to create the oikotarian within Mary, without sex, which is the soul and the body that's going to be developed so the word can become flesh. So that Jesus can interact physically in the world as being part human, not just on that temporary sort of basis, but part human because it's a human soul and body that's been grown up within the womb, and then atone for the sins of the world as the creator of the world at God's command, right? That's the word of God. Mm-hmm. And so if we understand that, then if you have a body, you can pass on that DNA, and that's how the procreation happens. And then you create these demigod giants that originally have an immortal spirit. So you have a god that is a god of this world, not God of the spirit world in heaven. And so God eliminates the ability for that body to continue forever. And so when they die, their bodies don't go to sleep like humans. And again, if people, I mean, it says over and over and over and over in the Bible about that we sleep. There's only a parable, which I won't go too far into the minutiae on this, that suggests that, in Abraham's bosom, but a parable is a common myth or story of the time that's used for a moral point. Yeah, it's the point that Jesus is talking about. If somebody comes back from the dead, or several people, nobody would listen to them anyways, and they wouldn't change their ways. That's the moral of the story. But humans sleep. But the immortal counterfeit spirit, the daemon spirit, isn't allowed to sleep, and it's not allowed to go to heaven. So it's either going to go two places. It's going to wander, or it's going to go to the abyss prison, as Ezekiel 32 and Isaiah 14 talk about, in the sides of the abyss, for the terrible ones, the worst of the Nephilim and the Rephaim. And so these are the demon spirits that Jesus encounters, right? He deals with them all of the time, and they're afraid that Jesus is going to send them to either the abyss or to the lake of fire before their time, particularly with the ones in Legion. So when it says evil spirit, understand evil as not saying demon there, but it's talking about these evil spirits. But where you see devils, that goes back to the Greek word daema, demon, as we transliterate it. Whereas when it's used for Satan, that's the diablos word in Greek. So they're two different things that they're talking about. And of course, Satan is the prince of the demons and the angels. So they answer to him. So when you start to understand how system works in terms of the physical world, and that the world is corrupt, you understand why, when fallen angels were living in this world in long periods of time, interacting with humans, that the world was corrupting them as well by the temptations. But they're the cause of the evil.
Okay, so in my understanding then, on the theory of them being, of the Rephaim and the Nephilim, particularly the Rephaim being created after the flood, so in your mind, is that the spirits but becoming incarnate, becoming physical beings, and then replicating from there?
Well, the giants would recreate afterwards, right? Either between themselves, one presumes that there's male and female, or with humans as well. So there's a certain amount that are going to be created from the angels with human females. So what happens after the flood, with that being the theory that I tend to go with, is that you have, after Babel, you have spreading out of the people. And so as they spread out, they're going to come into contact with the fallen angels, and they're going to establish polytheism. That sort of gets the seed planted at Babel, but they're going to be completely sort of submersed into polytheism for the most part afterwards, which is why Abraham is going to be created, a couple 100 to 300 years later. And so when we have these fallen angels, and particularly when it comes to the polytheist accounts, they focus on Sodom and Gomorrah in terms of where the giants were created. So in a lot of the Gnostic texts, you're going to see that Gomorrah was the creation before the flood. But after the flood, Sodom was where it starts, which starts to make sense of the Sodom and Gomorrah story a little bit more for people in terms of a little larger context. So it's the angels that are producing with males and females, because we get accounts, at least in polytheism, of goddesses also creating with human males. And so, but a classic example of us understanding this after the flood might be, Hercules, who's the son of Zeus, right? And he's a hero and a titan, and he's classified as a giant in Greek mythology. So he would be a post-diluvian giant. And then there's I'm going to pronounce it a little bit differently, a Hercules, which is often conflated with Hercules, but there's a Hercules god and a Hercules named giant before the flood. Just as like Gilgamesh, it shows up as that giant before the flood in books like the Book of Giants, Enoch Book of Giants, for example. That's where it's most famous for. And then there's a couple other locations that sort of extend off of that book, separate from the account that's the Epic of Gilgamesh that has him showing up after the flood. And as he shows up in the Sumerian genealogies of the kings as the son of Lugabanda after the flood, king of Uruk. And of course, he was 11 cubits tall, and that would make him 19 feet tall as a king and 7 feet wide at 4 cubits wide.
Okay, cool. So, and it does seem like we have a lot of good evidence. I mean, there's physical evidence of, skulls with elongated skulls and things like that. Do you think that is related to these entities?
Oh, absolutely. We have 2 sets of elongated skulls. One is what humans did as a binding to the babies to create and emulate the demigods. And I'll come back to the demigods in a minute. But these are smaller skulls. The thing that you can't do with binding is make them larger. You can't create more volume in the skull. But the elongated skulls of the giants are significantly bigger.
And I believe the suture is different too, right?
There's no suture in the giant ones. And so if you can imagine now, in terms of why they would look that way, in terms of what we talked about before, in terms that they might look like offspring as being offspring of their parents, and that they would take a similar sort of look in this world. So you have the Watchers, which show up in Daniel 4, and they're also used in the book of Enoch, is a classification of angels in that Saba, host of heaven. Saba is the Hebrew word for host. And you have 4 groups. You have archangels, which people are familiar with, like Michael and Gabriel. You also have the cherubim, which are the ones that pull, at least in the vision in Ezekiel, pull the chariot of God and they cover the throne. You have the seraphim, which work before the altar in Isaiah 6 as ministers before God. And they actually pull one of those pieces of coal off to take away the sin of Isaiah and puts it to the lips as a minister would, to take the sin away so that he's ready for this vision that he's going to be receiving. And then you have another group that Enoch talks about, which are the Ophanim. And those are the ones that show up also in Ezekiel 1 and 10, when it's talking about God's throne in the vision in earth, where you have these cherubim-like beings within the wheels, except there's one face that's different. And the wheel that's used there, and understand you can have wheel coming from a word called Gilgal, as in the Gilgal Raphaim for the wheel of the giants. That's at the foot of Mount Hermon, which is a famous polytheist worship site and ritual site, and or Ophan, as it's used for these beings that are within the wheels, as it translates out of Hebrew. Put on the I am plural, you got Ophanim, that sort of, even though we don't have a full Hebrew manuscript of the book of Enoch, whether or not it's been corrupted or not down through the years, there's translations into Ge'ez, which is the Ethiopian version, or into Aramaic, or into the Greek version. You can see that root of Hebrew words kind of showing up in Enoch, that it was based there at least at one time. And so these are the Watchers. Now, at the top of that hierarchy are the seraphim. And they, as they're depicted in Daniel, are overseeing the governance and the commands. These are the loyal ones from the throne of God, and they're also responsible for the development of and the worshiping of God, just as they're the ministers before God. So now imagine seraphim as fallen ones, the Nephilim of the Shemaim. That's where the Hebrew word Nephil comes from, is Nephal, which means fallen, but the I am is the fallen ones, the fallen angels of the Shemaim. Shema is heaven, and they're the heavenly ones and the fallen ones. And these are These are the fiery serpent ones known as the seraphim, because they're described as seraph, which and I am is the plural again, and they have a serpent face. So if we understand now what happens in polytheism around the world, we see serpentine gods and dragon gods all over the world. And these were six-winged angels. They were a fiery serpent-faced dragon, right? Because in antiquity, a serpent and a dragon were considered essentially the same. And you get a few different versions, like with Leviathan and Tiamat, when Tiamat is a female parent god, along with goddess, I should say, along with Anu in the Sumerian pantheon, and they're more of the serpent beast of the sea type of sort of imagery that they get, but sort of in the same serpentine classification. But it's the ones that are the six-winged fallen seraphim that I'm going to focus on. These are the sons of God that are talked about in Genesis 6:4. And we know they're angels because you get Job 1:6-1 talking about the sons of God presenting themselves in heaven. Humans don't do that, although people say it's maybe that happened on earth with humans. We don't get scripture for that. And then we also know in Job 38:4-7, you have the sons of God showing up with the morning stars at creation. Well, humans weren't there at creation. These are understood from an Old Testament perspective are the sons of God. They're not Sethites, and they're not adopted sons of God after the resurrection for Christians, right? That's something that happens in the future. Mm-hmm. So when we look at the seraphim as being the watchers, they're one of the watchers, and they're the sons of God that are depicted in Enoch as being watchers who mate with human females. So now imagine all the serpentine imagery around the world that goes along with the kings.
Yeah, it's everywhere. And almost every sort of big pyramid, there is depictions, or at least around that area, if not directly on the pyramids, of these serpentine beings.
Yeah. And that the kings were described as serpents in early prehistory and shortly again after the flood. Right. And so you have these gods who are producing offspring in the physical world that will live like them. So if you can imagine dragon creator gods in China, the Nagas in India, the feathered or plumed serpents like
Quetzalcoatl,
all of the Central and South American, and on around the world. You all of a sudden get an answer to what they might have looked like in terms of that serpentine look. And they bring it back. I know that was a long answer with these elongated skulls, right? You get that serpentine look. You get these huge round eyes that sort of wrap around, and they're said to have glowed. They're called the shining ones in polytheism. And that's because their eyes were thought to be able to light up, a room. Just as in the book of Enoch, when Noah was born, they're afraid he's the son of the giants because he's glowing, right?
Yeah, he has like white hair, right?
Yeah.
And he's glowing. Yeah.
And you have these very high cheekbones that they also had. And then this long protruding chin. And you get this serpentine look. If you want to see what that looks like in a diluted manner in terms of the bloodlines and the intermarriage that they would have had to have done over the time to get new blood in to prevent diseases like hemophiliac disease, Habsburg jaw, which is a more common one, of too much close intermarriage. And that you also combine that with accounts outside the Bible that they had fertility issues to reproduce, that they would have to bring in human bloodlines and DNA to mix. And so you start to dilute that size and look over time. But if you want to get a glimpse of what somebody might have looked like, I would, if I'm the audience, Google Akhenaten. He's the father of Tutankhamun, or King Tut, as he's commonly known as. And if you go to one of the museums that tours around, look at that statue. It is a serpentine face. This is the general look of what they were. And so they also tended to have longer neck. just as the Anakim are known as you take that back to Hebrew, it means long neck. Just as Og, who's the last of the Rephaim, the last of the giants that are created after the flood, or the ones that were created before the flood, depending on how you want to interpret that. His name also means long neck as well. So I have this long neck. And as we talked about with Gilgamesh, he was extremely wide, 7 feet wide, right? And there's this 2-to-1 ratio in terms of height to width that is sort of brought to us in terms of the size of Og's bed to demonstrate. And it's kept in Rabbah so that people would know that these weren't giants. These just weren't, taller ones. The Shazu, that they are also known by the Egyptians, the taller ones that we talked about earlier. So that bed was 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide. So that's going to be, he was a king. And Josephus says that's measured on 21 inches. And so that would make that bed almost 16 feet long and 7 feet wide. So he's going to be a little bit less wide. So he's probably going to be 4 or 5 feet wide. He's going to be, 12 to 14 or 15 feet tall. And it's that 2-to-1 ratio. So they were extremely wide. And you see that word coming up in the Bible as stout. It goes back to and have a few other words that will link back. Stout not as in fat. Stout is in wide and as in strong. The word az, which is that root word for Azaz, and Azazel, which will come out of that.
There you go. We
EL
know
being
that.
the angel part or the God part of the name, just as in Michael or Gabriel.
Mm-hmm.
So these were monstrously tall, wide, built like WWF wrestlers or NFL linemen, and they were fleet of foot and very dexterous. These were the ultimate warriors. And the average height of the human would have been 5 to 5.5 feet at that time.
Okay, cool. Yeah, that was a lot of great information. What was the name of the person you said that would show these characteristics well?
Akhenaten, in terms of the face.
Akhenaten. Okay.
Yeah. If you Google, King Tut, his name is going to show up because that's the father. He was part of the Armana dynasty, which is the other name that's associated with that series of dynastic kings. But he's the one that really shows that serpentine look and the elongated skull to boot.
How do you think then the Rephaim relate to the serpentine beings? Are they one and the same, do you think? Are you familiar with the verse in Job 26:5, where it talks about the Rephaim are formed beneath the waters, also their inhabitants?
Yeah, that's another great passage. And as you're talking about Job, for anybody who's double checking me on the word giant as it comes out into English, there is one time in Job where giant shows up, but it doesn't go back to Rephaim or to Nephilim. It goes back to Gibberim, which is the mighty ones, where that goes back to. That the Nephilim were Gibberim. Now, Gibberim doesn't always mean giant. It can mean, a human. It can be God's strength. It can mean a lot. It's used 158 times in the Old Testament, and not always for a giant.
Yeah, giant was mostly used as mighty ones, if I understand correctly.
Well, no, mighty ones is Gibberim, right? But it can mean a giant, but it doesn't always mean a giant.
Okay.
The root word is Gibur. Then the I am is the plural. You can also get might used, and it's used, I think over 40 times as Gibberah. And that's the AH is the female portion of it. So it's used for the word might as well.
Yeah, that's the word I was looking at, is Gibora or Gibor.
Gibor is the root for the Gibberim, but one's male and one's female in the Gibora.
Yeah, it says that word was used as mighty 63 times and mighty man 68 times. At least where I'm looking at. I'm just looking at the Blue Letter Bible.
Yeah, you won't find that really stands up in the application that it's used that many times for giants. And you have to be careful because David's mighty men, that word mighty goes back to Gibor for the Gibberim. And most of those are Israelites. They're not giants. Mm-hmm. There are a few, like perhaps Uriah the Hittite and a couple other ones that might have been mercenaries that were in there. So you want to be careful on and that's one of the things I try and get sort of people to understand is when you're translating and looking up the meanings of the words in Hebrew and Greek, I think is really good to understand that it can have several different meanings and it's got to fit the right application for the narrative. So just because you see mighty one doesn't mean it's always pointing to a giant. Because again, Gibor can mean is also used for God's strength, or even the word excel, right?
For sure. I was looking up the other way, so I looked up giant, and then there's several different words for giant, and then some of them mean mighty one, some of them mean, giant specifically, and then there's lots of other versions, like you were saying.
So we were talking about Rephaim in Job, I think chapter 26 is what you're referring to. So there are 3 words. There's actually a couple more that come out that we won't really get into too deep on the minutiae. So you have a root word 7495, which is Rapha, which is the singular form. And that means to heal, medicine, a physician, can mean sort of terms like that.
Too late, there's nothing to eat.
And it's an interesting word because it's the root word for Rapha as in giant that I'll get to in a second. But it's also thought that these giants had some sort of self-healing capability, whether it was a technology, let's say like a sarcophagus or something that some people speculate on, or they just had the natural ability to self-heal, which is why you would want to take their head suddenly and quickly, as David does with Goliath, and we get some other examples in the Bible as well. And in the Ugaritic text, it says about the Rephaim, is that was the way they did not want to die because of what would happen in the underworld to them. And we already talked about the demon spirits. So 7495 produces 7497, which is the Rephaim, which is the term for a tribe of giants and giants. But there's 7496 as well, and that's the word that goes back to Job 20 in Job chapter 26, and that means spirit or daemon. So again, all of those are associated with the greater meaning of the word giant, but they're specific to an aspect of them. And so typically you'll see that also translated as in other translations as Rephaim, not only as a spirit but of the dead, right? And so we want to be sort of careful in terms of how we understand that, but there's a connection here to the giants and what happens when they die, because you get this word that shows up in Ezekiel 39 called the passengers, and in some translations, it's English translations, it's the travelers. And this is used in an end time battle in the God War, and where mighty will show up. There's these mighty ones that show up, which is Gibborim again in the end time. But these passengers show up, and that is the Hebrew word abar, which means to cross over, like to cross over from another dimension through a portal. And it can have a whole bunch of other meanings, but typically it's understood as the passengers that cross over. And the Rephaim had the ability to go through portals between the underworld, which is we would understand as Sheol or Hades, where the abyss is located, and be able to go back and forth after they die. Where they didn't want to be was in the abyss prison in the underworld. But the underworld was a significant part of their rituals in terms of how the dead would pass over and be protected and find their way to the place that they're going in the underworld.
Okay. Yeah, I've heard that verse, Job 26:5, also referring to departed spirits.
Yes.
So do you think maybe that's kind of in this context what it's talking about?
Yes.
Okay, because after that it says, naked is Sheol over against him, and there is no covering to destruction. So we're thinking that in this passage is probably talking about the departed spirits.
Yes.
Okay, cool. Thank you for clearing that up. That's super helpful. So yeah, this has been really great. I'm trying to think of what else I did want to get into. Let me see here my notes. Have you heard of Tartaria, and do you know if have you found any sort of relationship maybe between the Nephilim or the Rephaim and Tartaria?
Yeah, it's a show in itself, but there's a lot.
Maybe a teaser for another episode.
Yeah, so Tartarus is another word that Tartarus, that Tartaria will sort of be an offshoot word. So Tartarus is the root word, and Tartarus means abyss. And it's translated once in the Greek end as Tartarus, that is translated as hell in the New Testament. And I don't like how they use the word hell in the Old and the New Testament, because it conflates three different locations: the lake of fire, the underworld, and the abyss. And that's why it's important to understand it in its original meaning. And so this is also known in polytheism as the abyss prison, that the giants who rebelled were sent to. And in polytheism, these giants escape out of Tartarus after the flood. And Tartarus is also known as a god of the underworld in Greek mythology as well. So when you're understanding Tartaria, understand that this is a reference that has meaning before the flood and it has meaning after the flood. So again, it's important to understand in context of what somebody might be talking about is what is the date that they're talking about in terms of its ancientity, and is that before or after the flood? So typically it's the giants in polytheism that escape out of the abyss after the flood, which is their story and how these giants show up after the flood versus a second incursion. And they escape out of a place in Scythia. And they are the root peoples after the flood for the Aryans and the Tartars and several other names. Understand there's about 4 different classifications of Indo-Aryans after the flood. So they're also known as the Tuatha De Danann before and after the flood. And that's the tribe of Danann, or Diane as one version for the mother goddess, but there's another version, it's the tribe of Danu, which is that parent god of Sumeria, who also created giants before the flood. And so the Tuatha De Danann are part of the intermix in this Tartarian peoples. And these are the people that are going to migrate to Ireland as the Tuatha De Danann, the fair folk, the fairy folk, up the Danube River, and the blonde-haired and blue-eyed versions as they go up into Sweden and Germany and Russia. But there's also a dark-haired version too, that people like Gilgamesh look like, right? Or the Hittites, they seem to have intermarried with them. They have that same sort of look. So there's red-haired ones and hazel-eyed ones. There's blonde-haired ones, blue-eyed ones, and there's dark-haired ones with big bushy beards, and they all have pale skin, just as Horim, as one of the Rephaim peoples after the flood. That word goes back into its various meanings as into white, as in white bread, and with its related words and things like that. They were thought to have very, very pale skin. That's where the name fair skin come from, and they were thought to be good looking.
Never knew that.
The term fair, that's where that whole term in terms of fair princess, and even when you see it in the King James Version Bible where it says fair, it's meaning beauty, right? And it's all going into that meaning. So you have an expansive empire of Tartaria where these 4 different types of peoples are going to branch out to. And so typically Tartaria represents in the modern kind of mythos, as I would put it, as this Eastern Empire, right? So you have Aryans that are going to migrate down into Persia. You're going to have Aryans that are related to those ones in Persia that are going to form the Achaemenian kings, the Heart of the Beast empires. Also, they migrate into the Indus Valley. They also migrate in a different wave of them. They go into the Ukraine as the Tartars and the Cossacks, and then will extend to create an extended empire into Moscow and set up there. So the Kievan Tsars are going to eventually set up in Moscow. And then you have the Mongols also extend out of that after the flood, and the Mongols.
Wow.
And they seem to be part of these beast empires who start creating these huge empires after the flood that the beast empires of Daniel 7 will extend out of. So we get Babylon at that sort of juncture in time as being set as part of those beast empires. But there are two other ones that are before that, as Revelation 17 talks about 7 of them. And you can get that through Assyria and through Egypt. My understanding of why I select those is that all of the beast empires are intricately connected to Israel throughout their history. So Egypt is where Israel grew up with the 70 sons of Jacob to become a nation, right? Syria is the first nation to take the northern tribes into exile. So they're going to be intricately part of Israel in the end time, even though we only visibly see the southern kingdom today in Judah. But so understand that it's important to understand these things about Tartaria. But let's not get before the flood and after the flood confused, because the technology before the flood was significantly higher. And the ability to build the buildings that they built for the flood and other things, we're just now starting to catch up to.
Yeah, so do you think then that a lot of the grand architecture that we see of these pyramids and so forth were created by the fallen angels or by the creations of the fallen angels, I guess?
There's two different versions of that. There's the old cities, let's say that the Sumerians said that they inherited, were built by fallen angels, but after the creation of humans and then after the creation of the giants, polytheism tends to break down a rebuilding of monuments and things as you're leading up into the flood. So there's two different age groups of these cities. So a classic example of one that might be a little bit older might be Jericho, because it's got, from a secular dating, a very long sort of history. But you have things like the pyramids that are being built that are older than the standard Egyptian chronology, but aren't as old as, let's say, Jericho, although some people might dispute it, that they would be a similar age. According to the Freemasons, and in their ancient history, and understand their history starts before the flood, and they sort of dovetail into a lot of things that the Bible talks about, and they accept that into their belief system. Not everything, right? So they take their beginnings back to 7 sciences that were created by Enoch, son of Cain. Understand there's 2 Enochs, one son of Cain, one son of Jared. And so I call one the evil Enoch and one the ecclesiastical Enoch. And Enoch, son of Cain, according to the Gnostics and Freemasons and secret societies, say that God taught Adam a lot of knowledge in Eden. And that makes sense to me, because he's running all by himself, and then later he gets help with Eve. But even that full employment, let's say, there's only 2 of them. There's 4 huge rivers running through this Garden of Eden, and there are orchards in there. There are crops being grown everywhere. There are all sorts of animals and things. Like, operate this type of garden, they're going to need knowledge from God, and God obviously teaches them God. But, and I'm not going to go into the good and evil aspect of it, because that's a different rabbit trail of how that knowledge is used. But this knowledge is going to be passed on after they're ostracized from Eden to Cain and to Seth and to Abel. Abel was killed, but Cain is going to use that knowledge for evil, and he's going to teach that to his son Enoch, who's going to separate it into the 7 sacred sciences that we know as the 7 liberal arts today, and that's going to merge with the knowledge from the fallen angels and to create mystical religions that I call Enochian mysticism that's going to cross the flood. It'd be part of that same organizational structure that crosses the flood. And out of the development of that knowledge, you get the development of the mystery schools, which is the beginning of the secret societies, which is why the Freemasons and ancient Masonry, which is technically a little bit different than Freemasonry, because Freemasonry is very low on the hierarchy. Masonry is very high in terms of the royal bloodlines. And so this knowledge is developed for the flood that is going to have them help them build these monuments. So they accredit, secret societies and Gnostics actually credit the knowledge developed by Enoch, son of Cain, is the knowledge that was used to build the pyramids. So from that aspect, you start to and they're built as sort of monuments to the greatness of that civilization, understanding that from a polytheist lens, because Sodom and Gomorrah were thought of as cities of light and cities of knowledge to the polytheists as well. So understand how they would perceive that. So yeah, that would be how I would look at that development of the knowledge, and that you've got these buildings that were built not necessarily by the gods, but certainly by the descendants of Cain, and then when the Nephilim are created, maybe even with their help. But they need that knowledge to build them as well.
Okay. Yeah, that was a good summary. Thank you for going over that. Do you think you touched a bit on the garden? Do you think there were other entities here while Adam and Eve were being created? Have you heard that before?
Yeah, and I think that makes some sense, because we get a kind of a hint of what's going on here with this serpent creature, which is the Hebrew word nahash, or nakash as we transliterate it.
Right.
And this is a walking, talking, intelligent, serpentine being that's going to deceive Eve. And I know a lot of people say, well, no, that's Satan that's doing it. Well, Satan isn't the one who loses his legs, isn't the one that loses his arms, doesn't lose his speech, doesn't lose his intelligence. So it's not Satan that does it. He may be coaching this Nakash serpent, or he may be the avatar, and the serpent is the avatara, just as he does that with Judas. When Judas needs help to betray Jesus, he enters into Judas to do that. So we know biblically that fallen angels can do that. So I don't think that's allegorical. I think that's actual fact. But he could have entered in to help the serpent, or he could have coached. I don't know which, but what I do know is that in Ezekiel 28, he's described as being in Eden. So he's involved, but he's not the one who actually does the actual deception. So that's our first indication of other beings. So when we look now at the 6 days of creation, you have people being created on day 6, and then you have Adam and Eve being created sometime after day 7, which a lot of people will try and, I think, because we're taught this, to take back to, well, that's the same creation as the people in day 6. Well, a couple of things sort of come to mind on this is that it's a completely different creation story. The details don't match. They're created in multiple, male and female. They're told to spread around the world. They can eat anything that they want. Right? And with Adam, he's created first. Edom is created sometime later. So he's created in singular, and then another one. And then offspring happens after Eden. The sequence of details that are listed are different that are told in the account in the day 6. And they may be recreating non-corrupted animals at that point. It seems more likely if there's 2 different creations, because I don't believe the Bible contradicts itself. So, and I've got a document on this, and a lot of the topics I've talked about, if people want to get a hold of me through my website, the Genesis6conspiracy.com, number 6conspiracy.com, and ask for the difference between day 6 and Eden, or how do you know they're the sons of God. Just ask by topic. If I've got a document, I'll send it to you. I don't charge for any of that. And ask me any question that you want. It might take me a while to get back to you, but I will get back to you on it. So you get this seemingly 2 different creations that are going on. And then when you look at the New Testament account, in where it says that a day is like 1,000 years in the book of Peter. And you say, okay, that makes sense. A day is like 1,000 years to God. Does that then mean days 1 through 6 is like 6,000 years of creation? And then there's 1,000 years for the Sabbath. And then there's a creation of Adam and Eve somewhere downstream, and we're not told how long, not told day 8 or anything like that. So there could be a gap in there as well. So you start to extend that. So if you've got a longer period there, And if you go to the idea that not only did Nephilim show up, or giants show up after the flood, the Rephaim, as I like to view it, there might have been other things that showed up as well, either being recreated or survived the flood. And in polytheism, we get incredible accounts of all these different beings they created before the flood. So it would make sense to me that offspring gods who would have taken over after the flood would have done the same thing their parent gods did. And of course, they went to the abyss for doing that as well. So I think there possibly were other beings that were in there looking at the differences, and that I don't believe that the Bible contradicts itself. And then it starts to answer the story, where does Adam, not Adam, but where does Cain get his wife from? Because Seth is born, Adam is 130 years old, and I won't go through all the details, but it seems that Cain is going to be ostracized somewhere between 20 and 40 years old, because they're just starting to do the offerings to God. And that's when his offering is rejected, right? He's not doing the first fruit sort of aspects that he's supposed to do. And so if Adam is 130 years old, and we don't know, again, how long Adam is in Eden, but it doesn't sound like it's all that long, right? So let's put another 20 or 30 or 40 years. You have a gap that's in there. But where does this individual come from that he marries? And they're going to build a city for people there. Where do the people come from? Who is Cain afraid of? It starts to make sense if you have 3 or 4 races that are created on day 6. And that Adam, who receives a spirit for a special commission, and that's when you get the Lord God word show up. That you have Yahweh, which is seemingly the word of God, as it's sort of intermixing in that relationship that is going to create, as the first Adam, the being that's going to resolve the angelic rebellion. It starts to make some sense that there's 2 different sort of creations there, and there's a different commission that's going on, and a spirit is put in that is distinct or different than what was created with the people on day 6. Anyways, I have a complete document on this, and I have a chart that just sort of itemizes all of the difference if people want to get a hold of me on it.
Okay, that's awesome. Thanks for going over that as well. So could you elaborate a bit on who you think Satan is then? Do we have, because he's different than Lucifer, right? Lucifer fell with the angels and brought them and worked with Satan?
Well, a lot of people sort of look at that point of view. When I look at Isaiah 14:12, and I look at, it says, Lucifer, son of the morning. That Hebrew is Halel ben Shakar, Halel, son of the morning. You have an El name on there. That seems to be a specific name. And Lucifer, it is an Italian word that is related to the planet Venus in Italian, that is inserted into an English language for a Hebrew word. And it makes no sense. Lucifer is also the god of the Freemasons in Gnosticism, one of the titles that they call him. What we do know is this, and I think it's Halel is one of his names, and I think he has multiple names and multiple titles. And so I think what is being told here is the fall of Halel. And who did Jesus say Satan is? He's the one in Luke 10, where he's talking about he saw Satan fall from heaven like lightning. He's equating that to being the same, just as the same being is the one that falls in Ezekiel 28. Now, we have to be careful in some of these prophecies that I like to call dual prophecies, because you have prehistory that's mixed in terms of the angelic rebellion that's going on in Isaiah 14, what's going on in prehistory in Ezekiel 28. I won't go through all of the dual prophecies. And you have some allegories in there that are sort of beast kings of the time, like the king of Babylon and the Assyrian in Isaiah 14. And you have an allegorical word that comes out of it that's not used anywhere in the Bible, but as in the definitions of Halel, there's another word, Helel, which is figuratively the king of Babylon. It's not the same word, but we don't get that Hebrew word used anywhere in the Bible if we get the king of Babylon. You get that king of the time of the prophet for the prophecies, and then you also get a reference to what happens in the end time. They're all doing the same thing. So Satan tried to raise his throne to be like God in heaven, the angelic rebellion. You have all of the beast kings of prophecy trying to do that. You had Nimrod trying to do that at Babel, which is the root word for Babylon. And you have, in the end time, Antichrist in Daniel 8 trying to do that as well, just as he's with Satan and the dragon in Revelation 12 in the time of Judah escaping to the wilderness, and he's received the power from the dragon in Revelation 13. So understand that these dual prophecies, you have to understand the prehistory, and also understand its prophecy for that time, and it has end time implications. And that's why some of the details don't always match up with the time of the prophet. So with, let's say, Nebuchadnezzar or Shalmaneser and the Assyrian kings that would have been associated with the exile of the northern tribes of Israel, right? Some of the details don't quite fit because it's talking about also the end times. So they're called dual prophecies in my understanding of that. And so if you know that, then we can look at the king of Tyrus and that same sort of allegorical prophetic allegory that's used, and it's used consistently in other passages. Jeremiah 51 is another one where you're going to see that in there. But anyways, I won't go through all of them. But you have Tyrus, who is this Babylon type king. Tyrus is obviously a Phoenician king, and he's like a Phoenician economic powerhouse. But yet, he's not the one who, walked amongst the fiery stones in heaven. But we have this cherubim that walks amongst the fiery stones in heaven. Also talked about. So understand it's talking about prehistory. It's talking about Tyrus of that time who's going to be destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar, because this is in the time of Ezekiel. Yeah. And it's going to have end time sort of influences. And you have this economic nature to the king of Babylon, or the Babylon organization in the end time as part of the meeting. But again, that's another rabbit hole. So this cherubim, as I talked about earlier, is Satan. But a cherubim doesn't walk amongst the fiery stones. That's the seraphim. Satan is more than any other angel. He's the greatest creation of God in the angelic order, right? And so he has many sort of forms. We don't know how many titles or names that he has. In the book of Enoch, you have Gabriel. That's named as, which means wall of God, which is in the Garden of Eden. Well, okay, that doesn't say Hail El, and it doesn't say Satan. So is that another title? Just as he has different sort of forms. He is also not only Diablos in Revelation 12 and 20, but he's also a dragon and a serpent, which means he's a seraphim angel in part. And he's also described in other aspects of the New Testament as an archangel. So he has these sort of different dimensions of these watcher angels that we're talking about, because I think he's greater than those other beings. And he also has 9 jewels on his breastplate, right? So that's another indication, just as the Levites have 12 stones, as being a minister. So I think in his seraphim role, he was the high priest for God before he rebelled. So we don't know exactly how many. I won't go through, there's actually more to it, but you get sort of the understanding that he's this. He has these traits of these other angels, I think, to demonstrate sort of his greatness. And I think that resolution to the angelic rebellion, and Jesus before he's being born as the Word, is creating Adam to be the resolution to the angelic history that's going to create the nation of Israel, to produce the Messiah so that he can become in the body to atone for the sins and then come back again. He is going to, as he's talked about in the book of Hebrews, he is going to be the new high priest as part of that resolution that Satan was also the high priest. So we know for sure, I think not for sure, but my understanding is that Satan would be a high priest, he'd be an archangel, he'd be a cherubim, and he'd be a seraphim. And he's described that way. And if you understand that the Bible doesn't contradict itself, it just gives you more information if you're prepared to receive it, then it starts to make some sense.
Okay, so it sounds like the way you see it is that Satan was sort of a fallen angel or a fallen creation of God, kind of like Lucifer, but still probably separate.
No, Lucifer's a myth, in my opinion. And when they're talking about generally Lucifer being a separate being, they're talking about a different Nephilim creature, if I'm following the same line of thought. That's Hel, H-E-L-E-L, figurative for Antichrist, figurative for the king of Babylon. And so when people talk about Lucifer as being a Nephilim or a Reptilian type character, only in that figurative sense. Like Antichrist is a Satan wannabe. He's a demigod wannabe. But Satan is the one that's described as Hail El Ben Shakar.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And then, so I guess, do we have a specific timeline on when the angels supposedly fell, or is it possible, or does it sound like they fell maybe around the same time of the Genesis story when, like, was them falling directly correlated with the serpent in the garden?
Well, that's the standard dogma, and I get that. But certainly by the time that Satan is involved with the serpent to deceive, that rebellion has passed. So it either happened sometime, after day 6, day 7, possible, and I'm open to that as a good possibility that's when the rebellion took place. But for me, it fits better for that even. But I'm not sort of doctrinal on it. I'm good either way. And so when you look at what happens is the language that's being used in Genesis 1:1 to 2, and you get this word that's used as and, that's usually as a pause, like something happened before. And that you understand when it says the earth was voidless or formless or void and formless, that word was can be translated two different ways depending on the meaning. That can become was as is or became.
Okay, yeah, because I've read that too and was curious. I use the YLT version, the Young Literal Translation, and the way it's describing it makes it sound like there was already something here that was void. It was, emptiness, the waters. Okay.
Yeah, and if you look at the words tuhu and buhu as they're used there, then you get, it means ruin, destruction, and God isn't likely going to create something that's a ruin, right? He's going to create something, as it's talked about in Isaiah 45, as I recall the chapter, for people to live in. And he's not going to create in vain, and that's the tuhu word again. And so he's not going to create something that's destroyed because he wants it to have people to live in. And so if we look at, and kind of overlay Psalm 104, you have an angelic creation that happens that's shown in the beginning. It's kind of a recounting of creation, but it gives you some interesting sort of information. And then you have later on in Psalms 104, you have when God sends the Spirit, the earth is renewed. What happens in Genesis 2? He sends a Spirit, and you're going to have a renewal of the earth, right? And so I won't go through the complete sort of thing. I actually did a 3-hour presentation at a True Legends conference detailing it out. And if you really want to see me lay it out, you have to order it through them. They've still got those videos that are available, or I have the documents I can send you, because I have documents on a possibility that there's what I call a renewal of the earth or the gap theory. And so when we start to consider that the earth was renewed and that this is a renewal of the earth that was destroyed down to its foundations, an earth, as in the book of Peter talked about, that was in water and out of the water and was destroyed by fire, And this was the earth that perished. The earth didn't perish in the flood. But if this destruction by fire destroyed it down to its pillars, then you would have to have a renewal of the earth. And a lot of people will say, yeah, that all makes a whole lot of sense. You're talking about in terms of the pillars and the fire and the gap and everything. But then you've got Exodus 20 that says the earth was created in 6 days along with the heavens, right? Well, heaven has 3 different meanings. That's the word Shama, and heaven's plural is Shamayim. And so it can mean the realm of God in the spiritual realm, where God dwells, that's heaven. It can mean what's inside the firmament, but it can also mean what's outside the firmament. In other words, the rest of the universe. So when it's talking about the heavens being created in 6 days in Exodus 20, it's likely talking about the firmament, because the firmament is actually defined in the 6 days of creation as being heaven, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's what it's sort of talking about. But it's a very long, and I'm just trying to give some summary of the details as to how you get there. But once you put them in a sort of a complete chain, it starts to make a whole lot of sense. And that might be a better place for the angelic rebellion. And that if there was a world before that, they might have had creatures on there before, although I'm fine with this being in that other gap that we talked about, like the dinosaurs. Because the dinosaurs are these serpentine type of beings that many of them had feathers, and they're giant creatures. And one wonders whether or not after the angelic rebellion that they had created a completely corrupted form of earth with these other giant creatures before that. And then they're doing the same thing again after the recreation.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, and I definitely encourage everyone to, pray about it and read your Bible and come up to your own conclusions. But that definitely helps fill in a lot of the questions and gaps that I had in my mind. So thank you for that. This has been great. This has covered pretty much everything that I wanted to go over. Is there anything you want to leave the people with before we end?
Yeah, there's, when we start talking about these things, what I'd like people to sort of think about, this has nothing to do with trying to shake your faith. This is about trying to increase your faith. And I tend to call myself a Christian contrarian. And my definition of that is that I like to verify everything for myself. I just don't take the word of what somebody says or what somebody says something might say. I want to verify it myself. And I would encourage people to do that and sort of be like what Paul ran up against, called the Bereans. He used to verify everything he was preaching. And I think we need to do that. I don't think that our churches today are teaching us enough about prehistory and prophecy. And I also think you need to understand prehistory to understand the full context of prophecy. But our churches aren't teaching this. And if we are in the fig tree generation, then we're going to be and are very ill prepared for what's coming. And I think we need to dig deeper, and we need to communicate these things without fear of ridicule, but in a logical way, and be able to back it up.
Yeah, that's good. And I agree. I think that don't take anyone's word for it, seek the truth, and know that, seek and you shall find. I've found that to be true in my life. And I think that that's what we need to do in these times so that we can have discernment and be able to articulate the reason we believe what we believe.
Yeah, and we need to be respectful of all Christians' views.
Yeah.
And we need to be able to debate these things and understand that nobody's ever going to believe 100% with what somebody else believes, but there's that sort of common ground that we can find that directionally will help us, because if these are the times that I think that we're in the fig tree generation, then that we need to understand that even the elect will be deceived, as Jesus warns us about.
Yeah, I mean, look at the Pharisees, even in the Bible, right? Like they thought they knew everything. They knew the scriptures back and forth, but
That's a
they
classic
missed
example.
they missed the whole point. Yeah.
They missed the whole point because it wasn't quite how they wanted it to be. They had preconceived conclusions taught for generations as to how this was going to play out with the coming of the Messiah. And they didn't look at all of the prophecies. They only looked at the ones that supported their preconceived views. And that's one of the disciplines I try to do in all of my research, and particularly with prophecy, is not leave out inconvenient passages. Everything has to fit. And I know there's a lot of prophecies, but here's the thing. You don't have to fear all of that. You may have not included it all, but if you start to go directionally, I think in the right direction, then it's going to fit. And here's why. One of the other things that I try and do, and I know a lot of people disagree with this, but I tend to put all prophecy around what Jesus said and not vice versa. And I do not apologize for what Jesus said. And he gave us a chronology. And when you put everything around that, all the conflicts go away. And a lot of people might say, well, I've been told that that isn't a chronological order. That is just sort of a topical order. Well, that's not quite how it reads out of the Greek. Out of the Greek, you get this word then and when. That's the Greek word "pot." And it's not inserted. It's not one of the inserted words. It's the actual word. And it means thereafter, when this happens, at that time. And so when he's using that, he's giving you a chronological set of events, because then this happens. And when that you see this, and then that happens. And then he even gives you at the midpoint the abomination of the last 7 years that are talked about in Daniel 9:27. And the other prophecies he's guiding you to in terms of Daniel, this is the time that Daniel was talking about. So you need to understand there's two halves. And then some people will say, well, the Holy Spirit is the restrainer, possibly. It could be Michael too, possibly. I lean a little bit more towards Michael, but it doesn't really matter to me. And they say that the Holy Spirit won't be here after the rapture. Okay, that's fine. I'm not going to get into a debate on when you think about the rapture but here's the thing is that we get a tribulation that happens in the first 3.5 years, as it's described in Matthew and Mark. And Matthew will give you the detail of the word affliction, and that's the word Philippies, which is the word that is used later on in Matthew and in Mark for tribulation. And it should be translated as tribulation. And in Mark and Luke, you get the Holy Spirit that's going to be coming to testify through the people. And in that chronology of order, then, that is between the start of the last 7 years and the midpoint, where that testimony is going to happen. And then all of a sudden it starts to make sense of where that tribulation comes from of the saints in Revelation 7, who are part of the first fruits, the ones in Revelation 6 are told to wait for. Right? And you have to sort of, when you put everything in place, you have to say, well, you have to fit into the wrath. Well, you have to know when the wrath happens, and it's different from the tribulation, and that there's a resurrection sequence, right? And you have to put that in. And if you understand that, you know that it's Christ, the first fruits. And then when he comes, those are still who are asleep, and those who are still there. And then there's Ezekiel 37 to fit in after that. And then there's the resurrection of those who don't take the mark of the beast, right? So because they're going to rule in Revelation 20. So there's a sequence of the first resurrection. And when you understand that, you have the last of the first fruits that are taken in the time of that tribulation. And in Revelation 14, where you have 144,000, we're not told that they're martyred. They're seen in heaven, and they're called first fruits. And the ones in Revelation 6 are the ones that are resurrected first as part of the first fruits. I think there's probably a resurrection of others a little bit before that, like with the 12 elders that we see, and maybe a few more after Christ was resurrected, of course, sometime after that. But what you have is a situation where they're told, wait for those who are going to be martyred like they were for the testimony of Jesus, right? So we have to include, that's just a small example of, if you put things around what Jesus said, you get the chronology right. And so if you understand that, then you understand why you get a summary of the last 3.5 years after the 144,000 are taken into heaven, along with the 2 witnesses who were commissioning for probably the first 3.5 years, because that's how long their commission is for. And that's why people are fleeing to the wilderness in Revelation 12 for 3.5 years for the last half. That's the people of Judea. And everything just sort of comes together and it fits. And so don't apologize for what Jesus said, and put everything around what Jesus said, and everything starts to make sense. That's my advice.
Yeah, I agree with that too. Even if you're just looking at it from a spiritual sense, if you're just trying to improve your life, I think that if you live by Jesus's example and his teachings, your life is going to be changed dramatically. Even if you don't believe, he is God or whatever, like you could have those semantics debates, but if you just look at Jesus's life, who would live totally different than anyone else, he speaks a lot of truth and a lot of things that have helped me personally. Just changing the way you treat people, praying for your enemies. That's revolutionary, and it's so anti what we want to do innately, but it will totally give you complete peace when you learn how to do that.
Yeah, and I would also, would advise you not to allow yourself to be pushed into these standard dogma formats that they might call you, preterist or whatever. Don't assemble prophecy the way it has been presented to us and fit it in as you go. Do not have a preconceived conclusion.
Yeah, look for information, not confirmation.
Yeah, and when they leave out passages or leave out parts of the Testament, be skeptical, because and again, I want to respect everybody's point of view on this, but my approach is you can't ignore the inconvenient passages. So if people think that the first 3.5 years have already come and the abomination has already come, or all the events just before that, I have to look at what it says in, Daniel 9, where you have the word end showing up in Daniel 9:26, which, take that back to Hebrew, it's the end time. That's what it means. And then you have this 7 years that are carved out. You match that up with Daniel 11, and this is from an Old Testament view that most of this argument will come from. If you go into Daniel 11, you get a significant period of a set of events where Antichrist sets up the abomination. From about 1129 on, you have to take into those accounts that those events are going to happen. And then you have to fit that in with everything else. You just can't ignore that and say the abomination has already happened and the first 3.5 years have already happened. Well,
so based off of your study and your knowledge and language etymology, would you say that we are, if you had to, I know you said you shouldn't be in a label or whatever, but would you say we are more pre-tribulation?
I tend to lean, if you're talking about rapture, to after the midpoint.
Okay.
Before the wrath.
Okay, got it.
Before the year of the Lord's favor, which is going to include the Exodus. So somewhere after the destruction of Babylon that we're told to come out of in Revelation 18, after Antichrist comes to power. And so again, if you start just to put everything sort of together, it starts to make some sense. And we know Babylon is destroyed just after Antichrist comes to power in Revelation 17, when the 10 kings hand their power over to the beast. Then they destroy Babylon. And then he sets up his own religion, as Daniel 11 talks about, a god of fortresses that he's going to honor. And he is going to locate his new religious center, not where Babylon City was located. And again, Babylon has many components, and it's said to be a city 9 times in the book of Revelation. So we know it's a city as well as a religion, as well as a geopolitical organization, and as well as an economic trading sort of organization. So we need to understand it all that sort of way. But we also understand that after Babylon is destroyed, a new religious center with a new religion, the mark of the beast is going to be established in what's figuratively called Sodom and Gomorrah, which is Jerusalem, right? Because he's going to have done the abomination and trample the temple for 3.5 years and the people there for 3.5 years. So again, everything just slides into place, and you can just sort of make it fit like a glove. And and another interesting thing is in what's going to happen in the first 3.5 years is that the gospel has to be preached to the world. Well, that's done not only by faithful Christians, but we're also told there's 144,000 that's going to be out there preaching, part of the first fruits. Probably to awaken Israel as well. Lost tribes of Israel are going to be called by name so that Jesus can break them out of those prisons in the year of the Lord's favor, and he can lead them, as the book of Micah talks about, as their king and their Lord in the second Exodus, which happens after the rapture, in my understanding of the chronology. But you have, I think I kind of lost myself. Oh, you have the preaching of the gospel I was talking about. I got down another rabbit trail. So you have the preaching of the gospel that is the 144,000. Plus, you also have the 2 witnesses that are killed after 3.5 years as part of that preaching of the gospel. And then there's one other one that is in that time just before the summary of the last 3.5 years in Revelation 14, where you have the 144,000 shown in heaven. That's an angel that's going to preach the gospel. And all of that is the first 3.5 years. It's events that we just can't ignore.
Okay, but you're saying that those first 3.5 years haven't happened yet?
I'm saying they haven't happened yet.
Okay, great, cool. Awesome. Yeah, I feel like I'd love to have you on again sometime, maybe go over that's a whole nother subject in and of itself, but that was a great teaser and sort of synopsis. Yeah,
and just to sort of finish off for kind of where I fit is that I don't believe the seals have been opened. I don't think the trumpets have blown. I do think we're in the fig tree generation, but we don't know how long that generation is. So we're in the time, if we are in the fig tree generation, in the beginning of the sorrows. And there's 4 catastrophe events that will get stronger as they go, just as the trumpets and the bowls and the wrath bowls, they all get stronger. They're separate judgments. They're not the same. 25%, 33%. Would be 100% that Jesus steps in beforehand. And so we're just starting to see those come and work together and get stronger as they go right now. Rumors of war, pestilence, famine, and earthquakes. So look for more of that to continue. And we haven't seen the universal religion rise up yet. We haven't seen the 10 king empire rise up yet. That's all going to be formulating as these contrived catastrophes, human created catastrophes, continue to get stronger as we move towards the opening of the seals.
Yeah, and I would just encourage everyone not to take this of like, oh, be scared, be weary, but be excited that, we're entering in a time, and there's a passage in the Bible where it talks about the blows and wounds cleanse away evil, and I think that's what this does, if you allow it, is to any trials that we may face will help our spirit grow if you're looking for that growth and if you're looking to God. So if we do start encountering things that seem scary on the surface level, remember that there's more than just our physical bodies here. So
excellent.
Sweet. Well, thank you so much, Gary. This has been so fun. I love talking with you. You have a lot of knowledge. The way you stream everything together is really impressive and inspiring. Would you please leave the people, just remind them again where they can find your work? I know your book, Genesis 6 Conspiracy. I'm working on that now and really enjoying it, so I encourage everyone to check that out. But yeah, we remind them where to find you?
Yes, the best way to get a hold of me is through my website at the Genesis6conspiracy.com. That's the number 6conspiracy.com. On that website, there's a contact the author. So if you would like a document in terms of what I was talking about today, many parts of it, or want to ask me a question or just want to make a comment, get a hold of me there. It might take me a couple of weeks to get back to you, but I will get back to you. On the website, there's also a generous excerpt of all 98 chapters. It's a big book. It's a book you can't speed read because there's so much information in it, but the chapters are mini stories and they're short chapters so that you can read it as you can digest it, because it's loaded with information from chapter 1 right through to the epilogue. So there's a generous excerpt, so you can see whether or not that might be a book that's interested for you, or you can get a signed copy from clicking on buy now and buy a signed copy.
Okay, guys, I'll finish with a couple of Jews finding Christ testimonies. I think they're really beautiful. I love these testimonies.
To believe what is right. God, I do not believe that Jesus is your son, but I want to believe what is right. I'm sorry, I don't want to get so choked up. Mother's side was
That's the Holy Spirit in you that makes you choke up. That's the Holy Spirit.
Orthodox, and my father's side was Reformed. I went to Hebrew school, went to Shabbat school services most weeks, bar mitzvah. President of my B'nai B'rith youth group during high school, and then went off to college at Cornell University. I was in a fraternity. There was one guy of the 50 guys in the fraternity who was an outspoken, vibrant Christian. I felt that he was better than everybody else. He actually lived his faith, almost like a saint. I was always curious about what made him tick. And so one day, I secretly followed him on a Sunday morning to his church and handed me a Bible, and they said we're studying Hebrews. I had no idea at the time that it was the name of one of the books in their Bible. This was surprisingly a very Jewish book. I both mocked it, and at the same time I wanted it. And then I started having this violent reaction or struggle or inner warfare within me about all this. Started becoming more violent. I got into drugs. I was selling drugs. It was like a war within me. It's the only way I can describe it. Started hating this kid from the fraternity, the Christian. This hatred would come out all of a sudden towards them. It was like two forces within me, almost as if they were struggling or warring for my soul. At one point, I took a large Army NATO type of knife and went up behind him and grabbed him by the throat and put the knife up to his throat and threatened to kill him. Because what he had in his life, the joy that he had, and the genuineness, and the vibrancy, and the godliness, really, that he had that I did not have, it made me jealous. I just fell down to my knees and I started crying. It was like God's presence was there, and I felt this tremendous release, and asked Yeshua to come into my life and to make me His, and to change me. It wasn't studying the New Testament that brought me to faith. It was just supernaturally God calling me and revealing Jesus to me. And only afterwards I really start studying the scriptures and putting all the pieces together. Once I committed my life to Yeshua, He started transforming my life. I'm married to my wife Elizabeth, and we met at Cornell University and graduated with honors from Stanford Law. I was on the Stanford Law Review, and we have two beautiful daughters. My younger daughter Naomi made Aliyah and was in the IDF. It would really put things in a totally different perspective, and so it changed my life for the better, giving me a new love for other people, and taking away the hatred and anger that I had within.
I was learning overnight camp. I was involved in Jewish fraternity. I mean, just a lot of these things, but I don't think at any time did I ever really fully know whether I believed that God was real or not. when it came to education or knowledge or information about Jesus, really what I knew was that we are survivors of Christian persecution. So no, I've never read the New Testament, and actually never would have wanted to. I was afraid actually of that, because I was sure that somewhere in there it had to say something like, let's go to Canaan to get the Jews. I understood from just growing up Jewish about the importance of atonement, and that really made me nervous. If God was even real, I realized that I was just so far away from him. I was mucky and dirty, and it was as if I was as far away from God as the moon is from me. And I had no way of being able to get back together with God or have atonement. When a good friend of mine ended up getting saved or coming to believe in Jesus, I remember being nervous for him and wondering what this was going to be like. I didn't even know if God was real, let alone anything about Jesus. But I really saw this change in him. It was like a serenity, love, and peace and confidence that he had. And I think because of that, I was more open to want to learn a little bit more about what actually happened in his life. When I read the New Testament for the first time, which I had not wanted to read, but when I read it, I was really just surprised and shocked that this was Jewish. And I'm checking all of these parts in the Old Testament and the prophecies in the book of Isaiah that are actually exact for what it was saying in the New Testament. And my mind was blown. It was a book about this man who really was the fulfillment of Scripture. And actually, it was when I was reading about Jesus in the New Testament that I realized that he is actually my way to be able to get back to God. I just couldn't fathom it before, and this was all making sense. I was really taken by him, that he was saying words that were just so true and filling and life-giving to me. And the first thing that I actually said was basically one sentence. And I said, God, I want to just tell you that I am sorry because I have hated your name. And it took me months to be able to go ahead and get to that point where I could be able to thank my God by name. I still have ups and downs in life, but it's a whole nother reality to know and to walk with God and to know that I will actually have the miracle of forgiveness of my muck and forgiveness of my sin. God has given me more love, more patience, but most importantly, forgiveness. And it is my heart cry that my Jewish people would be able to also know the truth of what it means to have forgiveness.
Okay, guys, one more. This one's a Muslim. A Muslim imam accepts Jesus. These are good too.
To test Jesus. Teacher, he asked. My name is Frasa. I was born and raised in New York City, and at the age of 21, I went to an Islamic seminary where I spent nearly a decade of my life studying to become an imam. As a child, I heard so many stories about Jesus Christ. Christianity and Islam, the two largest religions in the world, differ the most on this one central figure. Muslims believe that Jesus is a revered prophet of God. Christians believed that Jesus was the literal Son of God, God in the flesh. I needed to know the truth about who Jesus really was. YouTube, that's where my journey began. A video popped up in my recommendations, Jesus, the Son of God.
But God the Father has felt this pain. He lost a loved one, if you will, when he watched humanity murder his son.
From there, more and more videos focusing on Jesus and the Trinity showed up in my recommended list. I began watching clips with upwards of millions of views. And through all this, I questioned, what did Jesus preach? Did Jesus himself claim divinity? Did Jesus claim that he was the literal Son of God? Is the only means of salvation through Jesus? With YouTube muddling through my thoughts, I decided to turn to the actual source, the Holy Bible. I promised myself that no matter what I found, I would wholeheartedly accept it. If that meant changing the core fundamentals of my life, including my religion, then I would not hesitate to do so, as long as I found the truth. As it says in the Gospel of John, the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. One, that's all I was looking for. One unequivocal statement proving Jesus was God. And what I found shook me to my core. It changed my beliefs completely. It took me away from the mainstream Muslim narrative. It made me see that there was truth in the Holy Bible. Everyone needs to read the Holy Bible and study it thoroughly. What I found on my quest for the truth was not just one unequivocal statement, but multiple statements where Jesus clearly explained who he was and what his purpose was.
Wow,
How could
enjoying
anyone
this.
miss this if they claimed to read the Holy Bible? In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus says, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or abolish the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For I tell you truly, until heaven and earth pass away, not a single jot, not a stroke of a pen will disappear from the law." Jesus says, not a single jot, not a stroke of a pen will disappear from the law. But what law was he referring to? I found my answer in the Gospel of Luke. One day, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he asked, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus answered him, "What is written in the law? What is written in Moses' teachings? What do you read there?" He answered, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as you love yourself." Jesus told him, "Do this and you will live." What's profound about these verses is, first, these are Moses' commandments and laws. Second, the expert asked Jesus, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus responded, "What is written in the law?" This perplexed me. If Jesus was indeed God, why wouldn't he mention anything about salvation through him? Unquestionably, Jesus was focusing on the Mosaic law. It was in these passages that God clearly stated his oneness, his unity. In Deuteronomy, he is God. There is no other God beside him. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God. The Lord is one. I am he, and there is no God beside me. A recurring theme throughout the Old Testament. In the second book of Samuel, "For this reason you are great, O Lord God, for there is none like you, and there is no God besides you, according to all that we have heard with our ears." In the book of Isaiah, "I am the first and I am the last, and there is no God besides me. I am the Lord, and there is none else." If this were the case, and the God of the Old Testament was indeed one and one alone, did Jesus himself agree to God's oneness? I found my answer in the Gospel of Mark. Jesus stated, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord." How could this be? In all of those various YouTube videos that I watched, it was reiterated over and over again that Jesus was the literal Son of God. I went back to Jesus' original message from the Sermon on the Mount. Not a single jot, not a stroke of a pen will disappear from the law. But what does the law state about God's physical form? In the book of Numbers, God himself says God is not a man. In the book of Hosea, God again says, "For I am God and not man." So did Jesus himself believe that he was the literal Son of God? In the Gospel of John, we read that Jews picked up stones to throw at Jesus, who they claimed committed blasphemy. And Jesus answered them with this, "Many good works I have shown you from my Father. For which of those works do you stone me?" They said, "We're not stoning you for any good work, but for blasphemy, because you who are a man declare yourself to be God." Jesus replied, "Is it not written in your own law I have..."
Hang on, guys. I got to write that down because you know how I jump onto the Muslim sites and debate them. They say, where does Christ actually say he's God? And he says it right here. So just give me a sec to get a pen.
Just write down the time, 7:36, and do it after.
No, I'll do it. It'll take a second to write it down now. Okay, give me that. Hang on, guys. Bear with me.
In the Gospel of John, we read that Jews picked up stones to throw at Jesus, who they claimed committed blasphemy. And Jesus answered them with this, "Many good works I have shown you from my Father. For which of those works do you stone me?" They said, "We're not stoning you for any good work, but for blasphemy."
10:30, 34.
Yep, exactly. John, Book of John, wasn't it?
Book of John, 10:30, 34.
John 10,
30, 34.
32 to 34.
Oh, 32 to 34.
Yeah.
"Because you who are a man declare yourself to be God." Jesus replied, "Is it not written in your own law I have said you are gods?" As I read the Bible, I saw more and more that the title Son of God was a recurring theme throughout the Old Testament. In Deuteronomy, "You are the children of the Lord your God." In the book of Psalms, I have said, "You are gods, you are all sons of the Most High." In the book of Exodus, God refers to the entire nation of Israel as, "Israel is my firstborn son." Even in the New Testament, the righteous believers are considered as such. In Romans, "For as many as are led by the Spirit of God, they are the sons of God." I read over a dozen instances throughout the Old and New Testaments where individuals were given the title Son of God. What's even more profound and astonishing is that Jesus himself denied the claim to being the literal Son of God. In the Gospel of Luke, "And the devils also came out of many, crying out and saying, 'You are Christ, the Son of God.' And he, rebuking them, suffered them not to speak, for they knew that he was Christ." Even those around Jesus believed that he was only a man, a humble prophet of God. In the book of Acts, "Ye men of Israel, hear these words. Jesus of Nazareth, a man approved of God among you." In the Gospel of Matthew, and the crowds were saying, "This is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth in Galilee." In the Gospel of Luke, fear gripped all of them, and they began glorifying God, saying, "A great prophet has risen amongst us." There are many more passages where Jesus is referred to as a man, a prophet of God. So it begs the question, Why did people take Jesus to be God? I was on my way to the mosque. It was time for prayer. When I started my car, the radio turned on to the station that I had been listening to last.
Ehrman is the author of several popular books about early Christianity, including Misquoting Jesus and Jesus Interrupted. He's a distinguished professor of religious studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Did Jesus' earliest followers consider him to be God?
Well, what I argue in the book is that during his lifetime, Jesus himself didn't call himself God and didn't consider himself God, and that none of his disciples had any inkling at all that he was God.
That's not true.
The way it works is that you do find Jesus calling himself God in the Gospel of John, our last Gospel. Jesus says things like, before Abraham was, I am, and I and the Father are one. And if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. These are all statements that you find only in the Gospel of John. And that's striking because we have earlier Gospels and we have the writings of Paul, and in none of them is there any indication that Jesus said such things about him. I think it's completely implausible that Matthew, Mark, and Luke would not mention that Jesus called himself God if that's what he was declaring about himself. That would be rather...
That's not actually a good point, guys, because witnesses take a different view of what they witness. They give different testimonies. Just because they don't mention God, Christ said he was God, it doesn't mean they didn't believe he was. This guy's wrong, because Thomas said, when Thomas put his finger in the ribs and the holes through the hand, he said, "You are my Lord and my God," and Christ never rebuked him. So this guy's wrong.
Important point to make. So this is not an unusual view among scholars. It's simply the view that the Gospel of John is providing a theological understanding of Jesus that is not what was historically accurate.
That's not true.
Just like that, it fit together like a puzzle. As Jesus said in Matthew, not a single jot, not a stroke of a pen will disappear from the law. I found that even atonement, the core doctrine of Christianity, was at complete odds with what was stated in Mosaic law. In Deuteronomy, the father shall not be put to death for the children, neither the children put to death for the fathers. Every man shall be put to death for his own sins. Trinity, atonement, and the deity of Christ were all at odds with the Old and at times even the New Testament. These beliefs had to have been made after Jesus' supposed ascension to heaven, since historians themselves say that the Bible was compiled decades after this event. So what happened to Jesus if he was only a man, if he was only a prophet of God? The mainstream Islamic narrative has too many holes. I can't accept the substitution theory. The crucifixion did take place, and it was indeed...
Okay, they use that argument a lot, that there was a substitute on the cross, and I always tell them, well, so this substitute just got tortured and whipped and put on the cross pretending to be Jesus. Who would do that? That's just a ridiculous point to make. Indeed,
Jesus who was put on the cross, even his own mother, Mary, peace be upon her, saw him. This would lead me to the next part of my journey, the crucifixion.
Okay, I'm going to follow this guy. Notifications. Okay, guys, I'm out. God bless. Oh, it takes a picture of the last thing it sees. Yeah, I know. I haven't stopped it yet. Oh, hang on, guys.